My name is Desiree, and I am 33 years old. I sacrificed my youth-scrubbed floors and worked triple shifts to raise my little sister Nia after our parents died. So when I walked into the grand ballroom of the St. Regis Atlanta for her wedding, I expected tears of joy. Instead, I found a seating card by the kitchen doors that read, "Poor uneducated sister living off the bride." The groom's wealthy mother and my own treacherous aunt laughed in my face, expecting me to swallow the humiliation and leave. But then Nia stepped off the bridal platform, ripped the tulle of her custom gown, and grabbed the microphone to make a wealthy, arrogant family pay the ultimate price. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic people who underestimated your worth. The chandeliers of the St. Regis Atlanta sparkled like crushed diamonds suspended in the air. The grand ballroom was a breathtaking display of wealth and status, specifically designed to remind everyone in attendance exactly who the Pierce family was. Calvin and Vivian Pierce were the self-proclaimed royalty of the Atlanta Black elite. They wanted this wedding to be the social event of the decade. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from the ceiling, and a live string quartet played soft classical melodies in the corner. Women draped in designer gowns and men in custom-tailored tuxedos mingled, sipping champagne from crystal flutes. I stood near the entrance, smoothing the fabric of my simple navy blue dress. I had bought it off the rack at a department store. It was modest, clean, and respectful, but in this sea of haute couture, I might as well have been wearing a trash bag. I did not care about the judgmental whispers or the sideways glances from the socialites. I was here for one reason only. My little sister Nia was getting married. I had spent the last 15 years of my life making sure she had every opportunity I never got. Seeing her happy was the only validation I needed. A hostess with a polite but strained smile approached me holding a silver clipboard. She asked for my name, and when I told her, she hesitated. Her eyes darted down to her list and then back up to my face with a look of genuine pity. She gestured toward the far back corner of the massive ballroom. I thanked her and began weaving my way through the maze of elegantly decorated tables. The closer I got to the front where the bridal party was seated, the more beautiful the centerpieces became. But I was not heading to the front. I kept walking past the family tables, past the friends of the family, past the distant relatives and business associates. I kept walking until I reached the very back of the room, right next to the heavy swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. The noise of clattering dishes and shouting chefs bled through the walls. The table here was small, pushed into the shadows away from the soft lighting of the main floor. The tablecloth was slightly crooked, and there was no floral centerpiece, just a single unlit candle. I took a deep breath, telling myself that seating arrangements were just logistics. Nia was likely overwhelmed, and the wedding planner had probably made a mistake. But then I looked down at the single-place setting. Resting on the gold charger plate was a pristine white card with elegant swirling calligraphy. I leaned in to read it, expecting to see my name. Instead, the beautiful flowing ink spelled out, "Poor uneducated sister living off the bride." The air left my lungs. My vision blurred for a fraction of a second as the sheer cruelty of those words registered in my mind. This was no mistake. This was a deliberate, calculated execution of my dignity. Someone had specifically instructed the calligrapher to write those exact words. Someone had placed it here in the darkest corner of the room to remind me of my place. Well, 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 look who found her rightful table. The voice was smooth, dripping with false sweetness and undeniable malice. I turned slowly to see Vivian Pierce, the groom's mother, standing a few feet away. She was draped in a silver sequined gown that probably cost more than a luxury car. A heavy diamond necklace rested against her collarbone, and she held a glass of champagne with a perfectly manicured hand. Her smile was tight and her eyes were cold, holding nothing but absolute contempt. Standing right beside Vivian, grinning like a jackal, was my Aunt Yvonne. Seeing my own blood relative standing beside the woman who was actively humiliating me felt like a physical blow. Aunt Yvonne wore a bright purple dress that was too tight, and she was looking at me with the same resentful expression she had worn for the past 15 years. "I see the seating arrangement is to your liking," Vivian said, taking a slow sip of her champagne. I told the wedding planner that you would feel much more comfortable back here near the kitchen staff. After all, it is an environment you are intimately familiar with. We would not want you getting overwhelmed by mingling with people of our caliber. I stood perfectly still, keeping my face neutral. I had learned a long time ago that reacting to toxic people only gives them the power they crave. I am exactly where I need to be, Vivian, I said, my voice steady and low. I am here to celebrate my sister. That is all. Aunt Yvonne let out a loud, obnoxious laugh that caused a few nearby guests to turn and stare. Celebrate your sister, she mocked, rolling her eyes. Please, Desiree, do not act noble. We all know why you are here. You are hoping to latch on to the Pierce family wealth now that Nia has married up. You have been riding that poor girl's coattails ever since she got accepted into Spelman College. You think because you are her sister you suddenly belong in rooms like this. The audacity of her words was almost dizzying. Aunt Yvonne, the woman who had abandoned us when we needed family the most, was standing here accusing me of using Nia. Let us set the record straight, Yvonne, I said, stepping closer to her. My voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made her smile falter. I did not ride Nia's coattails. I paved the road she walked on. I scrubbed floors in commercial office buildings on the midnight shift. I cleaned hotel rooms until my hands bled. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously for 10 years to pay Nia's tuition so she could graduate from Spelman debt-free. I turned my gaze to Vivian, who was watching me with an amused but arrogant expression. And I had to do all of that because this woman, my dear Aunt Yvonne, forged signatures and stole the entire $100,000 life insurance policy our parents left us when they died in that car crash. She took the money, bought herself a new house, and left a teenage girl to raise a child in the projects. So do not stand there in your cheap purple dress and talk to me about riding coattails. Yvonne's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of red. She opened her mouth to argue, but Vivian gracefully raised a hand, silencing her. Vivian stepped closer to me, the scent of her expensive perfume suffocatingly strong. Nobody cares about your sob story, Desiree, Vivian whispered, her tone venomous. This is the real world. In the real world, pedigree matters, status matters, wealth matters. You are a high school dropout who spent her best years scrubbing toilets. My son Kendrick is a Pierce. He comes from a legacy of excellence and generational wealth. Nia is a beautiful, smart girl, and she will make a fine addition to our family now that we have polished her up. But you are a stain on this wedding. You are a reminder of the gutter she crawled out of. Vivian reached out and tapped her long acrylic nail against the humiliating name card on the table. I had this card printed as a courtesy. She continued, a cruel smile stretching across her face. A reality check. You are not part of this family. You will never be part of our world. Nia belongs to us now, and the sooner you accept your position as the irrelevant, uneducated maid, the easier your life will be. Eat your dinner quietly in the corner, and when the reception is over, I expect you to disappear and stop embarrassing your sister. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I did not break eye contact. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at Vivian Pierce and felt a deep, overwhelming sense of pity for her. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She saw a woman in a cheap dress. She did not see the mind that had built an empire in the shadows. She did not know that the generational wealth she was bragging about was built on a fragile house of cards that I could blow down with a single phone call. Before I could respond, the heavy wooden doors of the kitchen swung open behind me, and a waiter rushed past carrying a tray of appetizers. The noise briefly interrupted the tension. Vivian adjusted her diamond necklace, looking incredibly pleased with herself. She turned to Aunt Yvonne. Come, Yvonne, Vivian said dismissively. We have VIP guests to entertain. Let us leave the help to their dinner. They turned and walked away, their laughter blending into the classical music playing across the ballroom. I stood alone by the kitchen doors, looking down at the name card one more time. Poor, uneducated sister living off the bride. I reached down, picked up the card, and slipped it into my purse. I was going to keep it as a souvenir. The night was just beginning, and the Pierce family had already played their hand. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought they had stripped me of my dignity in front of the entire Atlanta elite. But they were about to learn a very hard lesson about what happens when you mistake quiet humility for weakness. I took my seat at the empty table, pulling out my phone. The real wedding reception was about to start, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. The clinking of crystal glasses and the soft hum of wealthy conversations filled the grand ballroom. I sat at my isolated table next to the swinging kitchen doors, quietly scrolling through my phone. I was not checking social media or reading congratulatory text messages. I was reviewing a highly confidential financial dossier my chief operating officer had just securely messaged me. The file contained the exact details of the Pierce family and their crumbling empire. While they paraded around the St. Regis Hotel pretending to be the untouchable royalty of Atlanta, I was staring at the undeniable proof that they were drowning in millions of dollars of toxic commercial debt. My thumb hovered over a screen that detailed their fraudulent loan applications and severely defaulted mortgages. I was just about to close the secure file and lock my screen when a heavy, menacing shadow fell directly across my table. I looked up slowly to see Calvin Pierce looming over me. He was a tall, imposing man who wore his custom-tailored tuxedo like a protective suit of armor. Calvin owned a massive chain of luxury car dealerships across the state and carried himself with the absolute arrogance of a man who believed his money made him invincible to consequences. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his expensive imported cologne preceded him like a warning sign. He did not offer a polite greeting. He did not smile. He simply stared down at me with an expression of profound, undeniable disgust. Calvin reached inside his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp, rectangular piece of paper. He flicked his wrist with practiced disdain and tossed it onto the table. The paper fluttered in the air for a brief second before landing directly on top of my gold charger plate, completely covering the humiliating name card his wife had left for me. I did not need to pick it up to know what it was. It was a personal check. The bold premium print from his private banking account stared back at me, along with the hastily handwritten amount of $5,000. "I suggest you take that and leave immediately," Calvin said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, explicitly designed to avoid drawing attention from the nearby VIP tables. "Consider it a very generous payout for the time and effort you spent raising Nia. You did your job, and you did it adequately. But your role in her life is officially over. She is a Pierce now. She belongs to a family of significant consequence and extreme influence. You, on the other hand, are nothing but a liability." I looked down at the check and then back up at Calvin. My face remained completely impassive, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me hurt. $5,000, I said softly, testing the ridiculous weight of the words. "Is that what you think 15 years of my life is worth, Calvin? Is that the going rate for scrubbing floors on the midnight shift to put your future daughter-in-law through a prestigious university so she could become a brilliant corporate lawyer?" Calvin leaned in much closer, placing both of his heavy manicured hands flat on the table. "Do not play games with me, Desiree," he sneered, his upper lip curling in contempt. "You know exactly what I mean. Look at yourself. Look at this cheap, pathetic dress. Look at the way you carry yourself. You reek of the projects. Your ghetto presence here is a glaring embarrassment to me, my wife, and my extremely wealthy investors. I have influential state senators sitting just 3 tables away. I have high-level banking executives who fund my luxury dealerships mingling near the open bar. I cannot have them wondering why the beautiful bride has a sister who looks like she should be serving them their hors d'oeuvres. Take the money, walk out the back doors, through the catering kitchen, and do not ever contact my son or his wife again." It took absolutely everything in me not to burst into hysterical laughter right then and there. This arrogant man who was currently threatening me, who was boldly calling me a ghetto embarrassment, was only weeks away from complete and total financial ruin. Those powerful banking executives he was so worried about impressing were the very people preparing to legally seize his commercial properties. And the only person in the entire city of Atlanta who could possibly stop them was sitting right in front of him, wearing a cheap navy blue dress. Before I could deliver the harsh reality check Calvin so desperately needed, the heavy wooden kitchen doors swung open again. This time it was not a frantic waiter rushing to serve the elite guests. It was Nia. My little sister looked absolutely breathtaking. Her custom $20,000 designer gown hugged her figure perfectly shimmering with thousands of hand-sewn crystals that caught the brilliant light of the overhead chandeliers. Her dark hair was styled in an elegant, intricate updo, and she carried a beautiful bouquet of rare imported white orchids. She was supposed to be in the bridal suite preparing for the highly anticipated grand entrance with her new husband. Instead, she was standing by the noisy kitchen doors looking frantically for her older sister. Her bright, anxious eyes scanned the dark back corner of the room and finally landed on me. A massive, relieved smile broke across her beautiful face, and she immediately started walking toward my table. But as she got closer, her bright smile began to falter. She noticed the severe isolation of my table. She noticed the glaring lack of a floral centerpiece. She noticed Calvin Pierce looming over me with an aggressive, threatening posture. And then she stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the check lying on my plate right next to the seating card Vivian had so thoughtfully designed to break my spirit. Nia stepped forward quickly, her eyes darting frantically between the bank check, the cruel calligraphy name card, and Calvin's guilty, suddenly flushed face. "What is going on here?" Nia asked, her voice trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a sudden rising anger that I recognized instantly. Calvin quickly stood up straight, attempting to smooth his tuxedo jacket and force a warm, welcoming fatherly smile. "Nia, my dear, you look absolutely stunning," he lied smoothly, effortlessly sliding into his salesman persona. "Your sister and I were just having a quiet, private conversation about her future. I was merely offering her a little financial assistance to help her get on her feet. Now that you are successfully married and moving on to better things." Nia did not listen to a single word he said. She reached past his bulky arm and picked up the white calligraphy card. I watched her silently read the words, "Poor, uneducated sister living off the bride." I watched the devastating realization wash over her features. I watched her fully comprehend the sheer depth of the disrespect her new wealthy family was showing the woman who had sacrificed everything to keep her safe. Nia let out a sharp, painful gasp. The rich color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and shocked, before rushing back in a furious, burning heat. Before she could speak, Kendrick finally appeared. The groom jogged over, looking incredibly annoyed and slightly panicked about the delay. He grabbed Nia's arm a little too tightly, his fingers digging into her skin. "Nia, what are you doing hiding back here?" he hissed, his voice tight with irritation. "The wedding photographer is waiting for us near the ice sculpture. Everyone is looking at us wondering where we are. We need to go do the grand entrance right now." Nia violently yanked her arm out of his aggressive grasp, holding up the insulting seating card and the $5,000 check directly in his face. "Kendrick, look at this," she demanded, her voice rising clearly above the soft classical music playing in the background. "Look at what your parents deliberately did to Desiree. They put her by the kitchen doors like a stray dog. They wrote this absolutely disgusting card. Your father just tried to pay her to leave our wedding reception." Kendrick glanced carelessly at the card and then briefly at the check. Instead of looking horrified or apologetic, he merely looked annoyed by the inconvenience. He let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and ran a hand over his perfectly groomed face. "Look, Nia, I know it is a little harsh, but you have to try to understand where my parents are coming from," he said, his tone dripping with extreme condescension. "This is a very high society event. We have a pristine public image to maintain in this city. Desiree just does not fit in here with these people. She is making our important guests uncomfortable. Just let the adults handle the trash and come take your pictures." The word trash hung heavily in the air like a brutal physical blow. Kendrick had just boldly called the woman who raised his wife trash directly to her face, without a single ounce of hesitation. I remained calmly seated, watching the entire dramatic scene unfold with absolute crystal clarity. I did not need to stand up and aggressively defend myself. I knew exactly who my sister was deep down. I knew the intense, fierce fire I had instilled in her since she was a little girl growing up in our tiny apartment. Nia stared at her new husband as if she had never actually seen him before in her entire life. The charming illusion of the perfect wealthy gentleman shattered into a million irreversible pieces right before her eyes. He was not a Prince Charming coming to save her. He was a weak, pathetic coward, hiding safely behind his father's massive checkbook. Nia looked at Calvin, who was actively glaring at me as if this entire situation was somehow my fault. She looked across the room at Vivian and Auntie Vaughn, who were now watching the commotion from a safe distance, eagerly exchanging smug, toxic whispers. Finally, Nia looked down at me. I gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent, powerful confirmation that she did not have to endure this abuse, that she did not have to force a fake smile for the expensive cameras and pretend to be part of a terrible family that viewed her bloodline as a contagious disease. The heavy tears that had been threatening to spill from Nia's eyes instantly vanished. They were immediately replaced by a cold, hard, focused fury that perfectly mirrored my own. Nia slowly reached up to her neck and unclasped the heavy diamond necklace Vivian had given her as a supposed welcome to the family gift. She let the expensive jewelry drop carelessly onto the table with a loud metallic clatter. Then she reached down with both hands to the delicate hem of her $20,000 custom gown. The exquisite gown she had spent agonizing months designing. The gown that was supposed to symbolize her triumphant transition into the Atlanta elite. With one swift, incredibly violent motion, Nia grabbed the delicate silk tulle and ripped it. The shocking sound of the expensive fabric tearing echoed loudly, cutting sharply through the polite chatter of the grand ballroom. Kendrick jumped back in absolute horror, his eyes widening in disbelief. "What the hell are you doing?" he yelled, his handsome face twisting into an ugly mask of sheer panic. "Are you completely insane? That dress cost more than your sister's entire car. Stop it, right now." Nia completely ignored his frantic screaming. She grabbed another handful of fabric and ripped it again fiercely, freeing her legs from the heavy, restrictive bridal train. She kicked off her uncomfortable designer heels, leaving them discarded on the polished hardwood floor. She was no longer a timid, blushing bride trying desperately to fit into a rigid mold created by the Pierce family. She was a brilliant, independent woman who had just painfully realized her own massive worth and the immense, undeniable value of the sister sitting quietly beside her. Kendrick lunged forward and tried to grab her arm again to stop her, but Nia shoved his chest away with surprising explosive force. Kendrick stumbled backward, his expensive polished shoes slipping slightly on the slick marble floor. He looked at Nia as if she had suddenly transformed into a terrifying stranger. The loud, aggressive shove had completely shattered the carefully curated illusion of the obedient, grateful bride. Nia did not waste another second looking at him. She turned her back on the man she was supposed to spend the rest of her life with and began marching directly toward the center of the grand ballroom. The ripped, shredded edges of her custom $20,000 gown dragged heavily behind her like the glorious ruins of a conquered empire. The music was still playing, but the lively chatter of the wealthy guests began to abruptly die down as they noticed the furious bride striding aggressively across the floor. People instinctively stepped out of her way, parting like the Red Sea. Vivian Pierce, who was busy laughing with my Aunt Yvonne near the beautiful ice sculpture, suddenly froze her champagne glass, stopping halfway to her mouth. I remained at my isolated table by the kitchen doors, watching my little sister take absolute control of the narrative. Calvin Pierce, realizing that a massive public relations disaster was unfolding right in front of his important investors, frantically rushed forward to intercept her. "Nia, please," he hissed, waving his hands in a desperate, placating motion. "Whatever minor disagreement you and Kendrick just had, we can quietly handle it in the bridal suite. Do not make a scene in front of the state senators and the banking executives." Nia completely ignored his frantic pleading. She walked right past his outstretched arms and headed straight for the elevated stage where the live band and the wedding DJ were stationed. The DJ, a young man in a sharp black vest, looked incredibly confused as the beautiful bride stormed up the carpeted steps and marched directly toward his audio equipment. Without asking for permission, Nia reached over the turntable and grabbed the heavy wireless microphone. She flicked the switch with her thumb and tapped the silver mesh grill twice. The sharp, booming sound echoed loudly through the massive ballroom, instantly killing the soft classical music. Absolute dead silence fell over the St. Regis ballroom. Hundreds of wealthy, influential guests turned their undivided attention to the furious bride standing on the stage, holding the torn remnants of her dress. "Good evening, everyone," Nia said, her voice echoing clearly through the state-of-the-art sound system. It was not shaking. It was incredibly steady, ringing with undeniable authority. "I want to thank you all for coming out tonight to celebrate the union of the Pierce family and myself. However, there has been a slight change in the scheduled programming for this evening." A collective gasp rippled through the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. Vivian Pierce dropped her champagne glass. The delicate crystal shattered loudly against the hardwood floor, but nobody even looked in her direction. They were entirely captivated by the woman commanding the stage. "You see, the Pierce family loves to talk about legacy." Nia continued, pacing slowly across the stage, her eyes locking onto Calvin. "They love to boast about their generational wealth, their impeccable social standing, and their deeply rooted values. But behind closed doors, they are the most arrogant, morally bankrupt people I have ever had the misfortune of meeting in my entire life." Kendrick finally managed to run up to the edge of the stage, his face flushed dark red with extreme embarrassment. "Nia, shut up," he yelled desperately, reaching for the metal microphone stand. "You are ruining everything. You are making us look like fools in front of the entire city." Nia took a deliberate step back, keeping the microphone firmly in her grasp. "No, Kendrick. I am finally seeing everything clearly," she replied, her voice echoing over the large speakers. "Your parents just tried to pay my older sister $5,000 to leave our wedding reception through the back doors like a common criminal. They placed her at a table next to the catering kitchen with a name card calling her poor and uneducated simply because she is not part of your pretentious elite circle. They wanted her to disappear so she would not embarrass your wealthy investors." Loud, shocked murmurs immediately erupted from the massive crowd. Several prominent guests, including the banking executives Calvin had been desperately trying to impress, turned to look at the disgraced patriarch with sheer disgust. Calvin stood completely frozen in the middle of the dance floor, his face turning an unhealthy shade of purple as his public image rapidly disintegrated. "My sister scrubbed floors and worked triple shifts for 10 solid years to put me through Spelman College," Nia declared, her voice swelling with fierce pride and unshed tears. "She sacrificed her entire youth so I could stand here today as a corporate lawyer. She has more grace, intelligence, and undeniable class in her little finger than the entire Pierce family has in their collective bank accounts. I will never marry into a family that disrespects the woman who literally gave me the world." Nia walked to the very edge of the stage, looking down directly at Calvin Pierce. The arrogant car dealership owner was trembling with pure, uncontrolled rage, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "Calvin," Nia said, her voice dropping to a dangerously calm octave that commanded absolute silence. "You thought my sister was just a poor, uneducated maid you could easily bully and cast aside. You thought you could buy her dignity with a miserable $5,000 check. You just made the most expensive mistake of your entire life." The ballroom remained completely paralyzed in a state of sheer shock. Nia did not bother to explain her ominous warning. She simply lowered the microphone and let it drop heavily onto the wooden stage. The loud electronic thud signaled the undeniable end of the Grand Pierce wedding. Nia elegantly descended the stage stairs and walked purposefully toward Kendrick. The grooming heir apparent looked absolutely pathetic standing there with his mouth hanging wide open in utter disbelief. Nia calmly reached down to her left hand and slid the massive 3-carat diamond engagement ring off her slender finger. Kendrick reflexively held out his shaking hands, expecting her to give it back to him. Instead, Nia stepped right past him, grabbed his half-full glass of expensive champagne from a nearby high-top table, and dropped the heavy diamond directly into the golden liquid. "Keep the ring, Kendrick," she whispered loud enough for the entire front row to hear perfectly. "You are going to need the money to pay for all these imported orchids." Nia turned and walked confidently across the massive ballroom, heading straight toward the dark corner by the kitchen doors where I was patiently waiting. The crowd parted for her once again this time, with an air of profound respect and stunned silence. When she finally reached my table, I proudly stood up. We did not need to exchange any unnecessary words. I simply picked up my leather purse, grabbed the cruel calligraphy seating card as a twisted souvenir, and offered my arm to my brilliant, courageous little sister. Together, we walked out of the St. Regis Hotel, holding our heads high, leaving the shattered remains of the Pierce family legacy burning brightly in our wake. We completely ignored Vivian's hysterical screaming and Calvin's furious threats echoing behind the heavy wooden doors. The cool night air of Atlanta felt incredibly refreshing as we stepped out onto the busy street and hailed a passing cab back to my modest apartment. The sheer adrenaline carried us through the chaotic night, but by the time the sun came up, the harsh reality of the situation began to set in for Nia. She was sitting at my small kitchen table wearing one of my oversized college sweatshirts, sipping a warm cup of hot black coffee. I was standing quietly by the window, watching the morning traffic roll by, mentally calculating my next strategic move. I knew Calvin Pierce. I knew men like him never accepted public defeat gracefully. He would immediately try to retaliate using the only weapon he understood, which was aggressive financial intimidation. Right on cue, a loud, sharp knock echoed through my small apartment. It was exactly 8 in the morning. I walked over and unlocked the front door. Standing in the poorly lit hallway was a tall, serious-looking man wearing a cheap gray suit, holding a thick, sealed manila envelope. "Are you Nia Washington?" he asked, looking past me toward the kitchen area. "I am her legal representative," I replied smoothly, stepping directly into his line of sight to completely block his view of my vulnerable sister. "What exactly do you have there?" The man did not argue or ask for identification. He simply shoved the heavy envelope roughly into my hands. "You have been officially served," he said, turning around and walking quickly down the narrow hallway without uttering another word. I closed the door, listening to his footsteps fade away, and walked back into the kitchen, tossing the envelope onto the small table. Nia stared at it, her hands trembling slightly around her coffee mug. She was a brilliant legal mind, but seeing a massive lawsuit with your own name printed on it is always terrifying for a recent graduate. She carefully opened the flap and pulled out the thick stack of intimidating legal documents. Her eyes quickly scanned the front page and the warm color instantly drained from her beautiful face. "He is suing me," Nia whispered, her voice cracking with genuine fear. "Calvin is suing me for $250,000 in damages for breach of verbal contract and intentional infliction of severe emotional distress. He claims I maliciously planned this public stunt to humiliate his family and cause irreparable damage to his corporate brand." Nia frantically flipped to the second page of the document, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic as she read the demands. "Desiree, he filed an emergency injunction." She panicked, reading the aggressive legal jargon out loud. "He is demanding an immediate freeze on all my personal bank accounts to secure the monetary damages. And there is a letter attached here addressed directly to the State Bar Association. He is threatening to file a formal character grievance against me. He wants to permanently ruin my legal career before I even take the bar exam. He says he will drag this out in civil court for years until I am completely bankrupt and utterly unemployable." My little sister looked up at me, her eyes wide with absolute terror. The Pierce family had practically infinite resources to legally harass us until we broke under the immense pressure. $250,000 was an astronomical amount of money to a young law graduate just starting her life. It was a vicious, calculated death blow perfectly designed to force her crawling back to Kendrick, begging for forgiveness and mercy. I looked down at the aggressive lawsuit sitting on the table, and then up at Nia's terrified, tear-streaked face. I did not panic. I did not scream or cry about the extreme unfairness of the world. I simply smiled. It was a cold, highly calculated smile that meant absolute destruction was imminent. I reached into the pocket of my sweatpants and pulled out my cell phone. Calvin Pierce wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial warfare. He wanted to use his fake money to ruthlessly bully my family. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed the loaded gun directly to the silent architect of his upcoming financial apocalypse. I unlocked my screen and pulled up my secure contacts list. It was finally time to show the fake Atlanta elite exactly who they had messed with. I dialed the direct number to Marcus, my chief operating officer at Apex Equity. The phone barely rang once before he answered. Marcus, I said, keeping my voice low so Nia would not hear the specifics from the kitchen. We are accelerating the timeline on the Pierce Motors acquisition. I want maximum pressure applied immediately. Pull every single lever we have available. Call the federal bankruptcy courts and prepare the hostile takeover documents. Marcus did not ask any unnecessary questions. He simply replied, Consider it done, Madam CEO. I ended the call feeling a cold sense of satisfaction and walked back to the kitchen where Nia was still staring blankly at the lawsuit on the table. Suddenly, Nia's phone began to vibrate violently against the cheap wooden table. It buzzed once, twice, and then erupted into an endless, steady stream of rapid notifications. Nia flinched violently, as if the small electronic device was going to physically burn her hand. She cautiously reached out and tapped the glowing screen. Her swollen eyes widened in absolute horror, and a small, devastated gasp escaped her lips. Desiree, she whispered, her voice shaking with fresh tears. You really need to see this right now. I walked over and looked over her trembling shoulder. Nia had opened the Instagram app, and the bright screen was completely dominated by a live video broadcast. It was Vivian Pierce. The wealthy matriarch was sitting in what looked like her massive sunroom, surrounded by perfectly arranged imported floral bouquets. She was dressed in a conservative but obviously incredibly expensive pearl white silk blouse, lightly dabbing at her dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. More than 5,000 people were currently watching the live stream, including hundreds of prominent members from her elite Atlanta megachurch congregation. Vivian stared tragically into the camera lens, playing the role of the heartbroken righteous mother to absolute perfection. My dear friends, Vivian said, her voice trembling with expertly manufactured grief and perfectly timed pauses. I come to you today with a heavily burdened heart to ask for your urgent prayers and spiritual support. Yesterday was supposed to be the happiest, most blessed day of my son Kendrick's life. We welcomed a young woman named Nia into our private home with nothing but open arms and unconditional Christian love. We tried incredibly hard to overlook her deeply troubled background. We tried so desperately to give her the beautiful, stable life she always needed. Vivian paused dramatically, taking a long, shaky breath before wiping away a completely invisible tear. But my friends, we gravely underestimated the dark, manipulative influence of her older sister, Desiree. Desiree is a deeply bitter, jealous spinster who has accomplished absolutely nothing of value in her own miserable life. She could not stand to see her younger sister marry into a respectable, highly blessed family. She maliciously brainwashed that poor, naive girl. She intentionally orchestrated a cruel public spectacle at the wedding reception in a wicked attempt to extort the Pierce family for money. The comments on the live stream were rolling in at lightning speed. Members of the Atlanta High Society and the church community were aggressively attacking us, calling me a gold digger, a demon, and a ghetto opportunist. Deacons from her church were typing loud amens and sending endless praying hand emojis, completely blind to the fact that their beloved Vivian was a total fraud. But Vivian was not working alone in this calculated smear campaign. She had brought in reinforcements to make her vicious lies look like undeniable established facts. Look at this article, Nia said, her hands shaking violently as she switched apps and opened a link someone had just texted her. It was a popular local gossip blog that catered strictly to the Atlanta elite circle. The massive, bold headline read, "The truth behind the St. Regis wedding disaster bride's own aunt exposes vicious extortion plot." I scrolled down the page and saw a large, high-definition photo of my Aunt Yvonne sitting in a plush leather chair, looking incredibly smug and righteous. In the exclusive paid interview, Yvonne had completely sold her soul to the Pierce family. She claimed that I had always been a lazy, calculating manipulator who aggressively forced Nia to date Kendrick specifically for his immense wealth. Yvonne even had the absolute nerve to claim that she was the one who had financially supported us after our parents passed away, portraying herself as a selfless martyr who had been deeply betrayed by my supposed greed. She proudly stated that she had tried to warn Vivian Pierce about our toxic family dynamics, but her warnings came far too late. She painted herself as the honest relative while labeling me a dangerous criminal mastermind. "They are genuinely trying to destroy us," Nia cried, dropping her phone onto the table like it was toxic waste. "They are using their massive platform to turn the entire city against us." My law firm partners follow that exact gossip blog, Desiree. If they see this, my professional career is completely over before it even officially starts. Nobody hires a corporate lawyer who is heavily associated with a massive public extortion scandal and a pending $250,000 lawsuit. I placed my hands gently and firmly on Nia's shaking shoulders. "Let them talk," I said, my voice steady and completely unbothered by the digital circus. "Let them put all their desperate lies on the internet for the whole world to see. Do you know why a supposedly powerful, untouchable family goes on a massive public smear campaign, Nia? Because they are absolutely terrified. Because they have no real tangible ammunition left. Vivian is acting exactly like a wounded animal backed into a dark corner. She is trying to win the highly volatile court of public opinion because she knows deep down she is about to lose absolutely everything else." Nia looked up at me, desperately wanting to believe my confident, reassuring words, but the sheer heavy weight of the aggressive social media attack and the $250,000 lawsuit was actively crushing her spirit. She was just a 25-year-old girl facing the combined wrath of a billionaire family, or at least a family everyone foolishly believed were billionaires. The stressful morning dragged heavily into the late afternoon. I made Nia turn off her phone completely and convinced her to take a long, hot shower to calm her frayed nerves. I sat quietly in the living room reviewing the complex financial portfolios Marcus had urgently sent over, meticulously preparing my massive legal counterstrike. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy, exhausted silence of my apartment was abruptly shattered by a loud, aggressive knock on the front door. The cheap wooden door actually vibrated on its hinges from the sheer, aggressive force of the pounding. It was not the quick, polite, professional knock of a regular delivery driver. It was a highly demanding, arrogant pounding that clearly communicated extreme wealth and deep entitlement. I stood up, smoothed my casual, comfortable clothes, and walked slowly to the door. When I pulled it open, I was immediately greeted by the highly unpleasant sight of Kendrick Pierce. The disgraced, arrogant groom was standing right in my narrow, poorly lit hallway wearing a sharp, expensive tailored suit, looking incredibly smug and victorious. He was not alone. Flanking him closely on either side were two older white men in expensive dark suits, carrying thick, imported leather briefcases. They had the unmistakable, predatory, sharp look of high-priced, ruthless corporate lawyers. "Well, well, well," Kendrick sneered loudly, looking around my modest apartment hallway with blatant, unfiltered disgust. "It smells exactly like poverty and desperation in here." I always genuinely wondered how the other half lived their pathetic little lives. I did not move aside to politely let them in. I stood firmly and securely in the doorway, crossing my arms defensively over my chest. "State your exact business, Kendrick," I demanded coldly. "You are currently trespassing on private property, and I have absolutely no patience for your childish games today." Kendrick chuckled darkly, adjusting his expensive silk tie with a practiced, arrogant flick of his wrist. "Oh, we are going to have a little serious chat, Desiree, whether you happen to like it or not. You and your sister made a massive, unforgivable mistake last night. But because my family is incredibly gracious and highly forgiving, I have personally come here to offer you one final desperate chance to fix it before we completely obliterate your miserable lives." He snapped his fingers sharply, and the lawyer standing on his right immediately opened his leather briefcase, extracting a thick, legally bound document and a sleek silver luxury pen. The lawyer handed the items respectfully to Kendrick, who held them up with an arrogant, highly victorious smirk plastering his face. "This is a highly binding, strict, non-disclosure and legal settlement agreement," Kendrick announced, his voice dripping with extreme condescension and unearned authority. "We already know you do not have $250,000, Desiree. We know you are a broke, uneducated former maid who could not even afford a decent designer dress for a luxury high society wedding. So I am generously offering you a very easy way out of the massive civil lawsuit my father just legally filed against your sister. I remained perfectly silent, letting him confidently dig his own grave much deeper with every single arrogant word that left his mouth. Here are the strict, unnegotiable terms. Kendrick continued stepping slightly closer, trying vainly to use his physical height to violently intimidate me. You will pack your cheap plastic bags and permanently leave the city of Atlanta by midnight tonight. You will completely sever all forms of contact with Nia. You will never call her, text her, or attempt to see her face ever again. If you agree to completely disappear from our lives forever and immediately sign this non-disclosure agreement, promising never to speak publicly about the Pierce family, I will personally instruct my father to drop the massive lawsuit. Kendrick smiled a cold, calculating, cruel smile that genuinely made my stomach turn in disgust. And once you are completely gone, I will generously agree to take Nia back. She will publicly apologize to my mother on Instagram Live. She will immediately quit her little independent law firm job. And she will finally be the quiet, obedient, supportive wife she was always meant to be. If you really love your sister Desiree, you will sign this paper right now and walk away forever. If you refuse my generous offer, I promise you we will drag her ruthlessly through civil court until she is entirely homeless and begging for mercy on the filthy streets. The sheer, unmatched audacity of his highly toxic ultimatum was almost impressive to witness in person. He genuinely, truly believed he held all the winning cards in his hand. He genuinely believed I was just a helpless, poor black woman trembling in the terrifying face of his massive inherited wealth and his high-priced legal team. He arrogantly thought he could casually buy my brilliant sister, completely erase my very existence, and easily restore his deeply fractured, fragile ego with a single printed piece of paper. His two expensive corporate lawyers stood silently and menacingly behind him, looking at me with cold, detached, absolute professionalism, waiting expectantly for me to break down in pathetic tears and frantically sign the document to save myself. They fully expected me to instantly surrender. They fully expected me to blindly sacrifice myself to save Nia from total financial ruin, just like I had willingly sacrificed my entire youth to raise her. I looked directly and fearlessly into Kendrick's smug, wildly arrogant eyes. I did not scream in terror. I did not curse at him loudly or try to physically attack him in blind rage. I simply let out a low, highly amused, genuine laugh that completely threw him entirely off balance. His victorious, confident smile slightly faltered, revealing a brief flash of deep insecurity. "What exactly is so funny?" he snapped loudly, his sudden irritation quickly replacing his carefully manufactured confidence. "You think $250,000 federal lawsuit is a funny joke?" "No, Kendrick," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and dangerously soft, echoing slightly in the small space. "I think you are a pathetic joke. I think your incredibly fake billionaire father is a joke. And I think it is absolutely hilarious that you dragged two high-priced corporate lawyers to my front door to aggressively threaten me over pennies." I took a deliberate, powerful step forward, forcing Kendrick to instinctively take a nervous step back out of pure fear. I did not take the settlement document from his outstretched, shaking hand. Instead, I reached slowly into my back pocket and pulled out a single neatly folded piece of paper I had confidently printed earlier from my secure home office. I held the crisp piece of paper between my fingers and extended it not toward Kendrick, but directly toward the older lead attorney standing sharply on his right. The lawyer looked slightly confused by my calm demeanor, but his professional training took over. He reached out and took the folded document from my hand, sliding his expensive reading glasses down the bridge of his nose to examine it. I watched his eyes scan the top of the page. I watched the arrogant, highly practiced indifference completely vanish from his wrinkled face. The lawyer blinked rapidly, holding the paper closer to his face, as if the printed ink might magically change if he stared at it hard enough. A tense, heavy silence filled the narrow hallway. Kendrick looked back and forth between me and his highly paid legal counsel, his confident smirk beginning to falter at the edges. "What is it?" Kendrick snapped, his voice sharp with sudden, uncontrolled anxiety. "Is it a desperate forged check? An IOU? Tell her we do not accept payment plans from people who live in low-income housing. The lead attorney did not laugh at Kendrick's cruel joke. He did not even look at his wealthy client. He just kept staring down at the piece of paper, his hands beginning to tremble ever so slightly. Mr. Pierce, the lawyer, said, his voice tight and unnaturally strained. This is a certified bank receipt. It is a same-day wire transfer confirmation. Kendrick rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh. A wire transfer for what he demanded, crossing his arms defensively. $500, 1,000. I told you I am not playing games with this woman. It is for $250,000. Exactly, the attorney whispered, handing the document over to Kendrick with a look of profound, absolute defeat. The funds have already been fully cleared and verified by the Federal Reserve. The money was securely deposited directly into our firm's primary escrow account exactly 42 minutes ago. The financial damages your father claimed in the lawsuit have been completely satisfied in full. We no longer have any legal grounds to pursue the injunction against Nia. Kendrick snatched the paper from the lawyer's hand so aggressively he almost tore it in half. His eyes darted frantically across the bold black text, desperately searching for a typo, a mistake, a sign that this was all just an elaborate poor person's bluff. But the banking insignia was unmistakable. The massive sum of money was printed clearly in bold, undeniable digits. And right below the transfer amount was the name of the originating sender, Apex Equity Partners. Kendrick's face lost all of its color, turning a sickly shade of pale gray. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute shock and rising panic. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice cracking completely, losing its previous arrogant bass. "Who is Apex Equity? Whose money is this, Desiree? Who did you sleep with to get your hands on $250,000 in cash?" I stepped forward slowly, forcing Kendrick to press his back against the cheap drywall of my apartment hallway. "I did not sleep with anyone, Kendrick," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifyingly calm register. "I am Apex Equity. I built it from the ground up while you were busy spending your father's fraudulent money on expensive suits and sports cars. That $250,000 is absolute pocket change to me. I paid it simply to get your pathetic family to leave my sister alone." Kendrick shook his head violently, refusing to process the devastating reality standing right in front of him. "No," he stammered, clutching the wire transfer receipt like a lifeline. "No, this is a complete lie. You are a maid. You scrubbed floors. My mother said you were practically homeless." "Your mother is a fool who judges people by the brand of their shoes," I replied coldly. "And your father is a desperate drowning man who just picked a fight with the entire ocean. The lawsuit is dead, Kendrick. You have absolutely no leverage left over Nia. Now take your useless non-disclosure agreement and get out of my home before I have you arrested for trespassing." The second corporate lawyer, who had remained entirely silent up until this point, gently placed a firm hand on Kendrick's expensive tailored shoulder. "We need to leave immediately," Mr. Pierce, the lawyer, advised in a hushed, urgent tone. "If the financial damages have been completely settled, the lawsuit is officially moot. We have no legal standing here. Continuing to harass them will only result in severe counterclaims." Kendrick looked completely broken. The grand, victorious moment he had gleefully envisioned had been violently ripped away from him and replaced with a terrifying, unknown reality. He had walked into my apartment expecting to easily crush a poor, helpless woman. Instead, he had unknowingly walked straight into the jaws of a silent financial giant. "Tell your arrogant father that his fake wedding bill has been paid," I said, holding the door open, pointing directly toward the exit. "But be sure to tell him something else, Kendrick. Tell him that the $250,000 was just the entry fee for the absolute hell I am about to unleash on his entire life." Kendrick did not say another word. He could not. He turned around rigidly like a broken wind-up toy and walked slowly down the hallway, closely followed by his two defeated attorneys. I stood in the doorway, watching them step into the elevator before I finally closed my front door and securely locked the deadbolt. When I turned around, Nia was standing in the entrance to the kitchen, her eyes wide and her jaw slightly dropped. She had heard the entire exchange through the thin walls of my apartment. "Desiree," she whispered, stepping forward cautiously. Did you really just pay them $250,000 in cash? How is that even remotely possible? I walked over to my little sister and gently tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear. I have been keeping a very big secret from you for a very long time, Nia, I said softly. I promised myself I would never let my corporate life interfere with our family. But the Pierce family crossed a line they can never uncross. You do not have to worry about that lawsuit or your legal career ever again. They cannot touch you. Nia looked at me with a mixture of awe and profound relief. But before she could ask any more questions, I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up my cell phone. Paying off Kendrick's ridiculous extortion attempt was merely defensive. It was time to aggressively go on the offensive. I unlocked my screen and immediately dialed my chief operating officer. Marcus picked up on the first ring. "Madam CEO," he answered, his tone sharp and ready for instruction. I assume the legal team confirmed the wire transfer went through smoothly. "It went through perfectly, Marcus," I replied, pacing slowly across the small living room. But paying them off was just phase 1 of the operation. The Pierce family is still laboring under the massive delusion that they have real power in this city. They are still actively running a vicious social media smear campaign against my sister. I want to officially initiate phase 2. I am ready, Marcus said. What is the precise target? Calvin Pierce loves to brag to his elite church congregation about his massive chain of luxury car dealerships. I explained, my mind rapidly calculating the tactical financial strike. He walks around Atlanta acting like he is a real estate mogul. But we both know the pathetic truth, Marcus. Calvin does not actually own the physical land that his 3 biggest Pierce Motors dealerships sit on. He leases those prime commercial lots from a massive real estate conglomerate based in Chicago. That is correct, Marcus confirmed, the sound of rapid typing echoing over the phone line as he instantly pulled up Calvin's corporate files. He has 20-year commercial leases on all 3 locations. The terms stipulate that the landowner has the absolute right to terminate the leases early in the event of a property sale, provided the new owner intends to repurpose the land. Exactly, I said, a cold, hard smile touching my lips. I want Apex Equity to buy out the commercial leases of all 3 Pierce Motors dealerships. Do not negotiate. Do not haggle over the price. Contact the Chicago conglomerate right now and offer them 25% above the current market value in pure liquid cash. Tell them we want the deed transferred and the paperwork completely finalized by the end of the business day. There was a brief pause on the line as Marcus processed the sheer aggressive magnitude of the order. You are buying the literal ground out from under his entire business empire, he asked, his voice laced with deep professional respect. I want to own the dirt he stands on, Marcus, I replied coldly. Once the purchase is legally finalized, Apex Equity will be Calvin Pierce's new direct landlord. And the very first thing we are going to do as the new property owners is serve him with an immediate 30-day notice of commercial eviction. We are going to legally force him to move hundreds of luxury cars off our private property. Consider it done, Desiree, Marcus said decisively. The Chicago firm has been desperate to offload those properties due to Calvin's history of late rent payments. They will happily take our cash offer without a second thought. I will have our acquisitions team draft the final contracts within the hour. Excellent, I said. And Marcus, make sure the purchase is handled through one of our completely anonymous shell corporations. I do not want Calvin Pierce to know that Apex Equity is his new landlord just yet. I want him to find out the hard way. I ended the call and placed the phone back down on the kitchen counter. The game had fundamentally changed. Vivian Pierce could cry on Instagram Live all she wanted. Aunt Yvonne could run to every gossip blog in the state of Georgia telling vicious lies about my character. None of their pathetic social warfare mattered anymore, because while they were busy desperately trying to destroy my public reputation, I was quietly, meticulously buying their entire reality. Calvin Pierce thought his wealth made him a king. But he was about to wake up tomorrow morning and realize he was nothing more than a peasant living on my land. I looked over at Nia, who was watching me with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock and fierce pride. Get dressed, Nia, I said, grabbing my car keys from the table. Put on the nicest outfit you own. If the Pierce family wants to play high society games, we are going to show them exactly how the real elite operate in this city. Where are we going? Nia asked, rushing toward her bedroom. "We are going shopping," I replied. "Because tomorrow night, Calvin Pierce has a highly exclusive dinner meeting with the mysterious billionaire CEO who just bought his $15 million toxic debt. And I need to make absolutely sure I look the part when I finally introduce myself." While Nia and I were standing in the middle of a high-end boutique, running my matte black corporate card for designer silk dresses and tailored blazers, Calvin Pierce was currently barricaded inside his sprawling executive office in downtown Atlanta. The heavy mahogany doors were locked tight. The blinds on the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking his flagship luxury car lot were drawn completely shut. The self-proclaimed king of the Atlanta Black elite was sweating profusely through his custom-imported dress shirt. His massive desk was covered in highly past-due notices from aggressive creditors, desperate final warning letters from commercial banks, and a dozen different terrifying legal summons. The beautiful, sparkling facade of Pierce Motors was nothing but a hollow, rapidly decaying shell. Calvin Pierce was entirely, completely, and hopelessly broke. For the past 5 years, Calvin had been recklessly running a massive financial Ponzi scheme disguised as a legitimate family business empire. He had been secretly pulling highly illegal secondary mortgages on his dealership properties, drastically overinflating his inventory assets on federal tax documents, and wildly spending money he absolutely did not have just to aggressively maintain his fake high society image. He bought his wife Vivian her expensive diamond necklaces with stolen corporate funds. He paid for his son Kendrick's lavish lifestyle using highly fraudulent business loans. The crushing weight of his $15 million commercial debt had finally caught up to him. The federal auditors were officially circling his crumbling empire like hungry vultures. And that was exactly why the Grand St. Regis wedding had been so incredibly crucial to his survival. Calvin did not genuinely care about my sister Nia. Vivian did not actually want to welcome a young woman from a low-income neighborhood into their precious elite social circle. They had aggressively targeted my sister for one highly specific, highly malicious reason: her absolute pristine financial record. Nia had zero student debt because I had worked myself to the bone to pay every single penny of her tuition in cash. She had an absolutely flawless credit score and a highly respected corporate law degree from Spelman College. To a desperate, drowning fraudster like Calvin Pierce, Nia was not a daughter-in-law. She was a beautiful, shiny, clean legal shield. Calvin had secretly prepared a massive stack of highly fraudulent federal business loan applications and complex corporate restructuring documents. His ultimate master plan was to aggressively manipulate Nia into blindly co-signing those federal documents the moment she officially married Kendrick. With her pristine credit history and her brand-new legal credentials attached to the massive loans, the commercial banks would have immediately approved the emergency funding. Calvin would have successfully secured enough fresh capital to quickly pay off his most aggressive creditors and keep his fake luxury empire running for a few more years. He had planned to legally chain my innocent sister to his massive sinking ship, deliberately destroying her financial future to selfishly save his own. But the spectacular, highly public disaster at the St. Regis wedding reception had completely obliterated his master plan. When Nia threw that expensive engagement ring into Kendrick's champagne glass and proudly walked out of the grand ballroom, she did not just break off a toxic relationship. She completely destroyed Calvin's only remaining lifeline. Calvin sat heavily in his expensive leather executive chair, aggressively rubbing his pounding temples. The $250,000 civil lawsuit he had filed against Nia that very morning was never actually about recovering wedding expenses or defending his injured family pride. It was a desperate, highly pathetic extortion attempt to force her back into the marriage through sheer financial terror. It was a vicious, calculated gamble born out of pure, absolute desperation. A sharp, frantic knock echoed against the locked mahogany doors of his office. Calvin violently jumped in his seat, his heart hammering against his ribs. He quickly shoved a stack of brightly colored past-due notices into his desk drawer and cleared his dry throat. "Come in," he barked, trying desperately to project his usual deep, booming, authoritative voice. The heavy door slowly creaked open, and Kendrick stepped into the dark office. The arrogant golden boy of the Pierce family looked completely destroyed. His expensive suit jacket was severely wrinkled, his designer tie was pulled loose, and his face was entirely drained of color. He looked like a man who had just seen a terrifying ghost. Calvin immediately stood up, his eyes wide with desperate anticipation. "Well," Calvin demanded, his voice tight with extreme anxiety, "did you get the signed settlement agreement? Did that poor, uneducated sister of hers finally break down and pack her cheap bags? Is Nia coming back to apologize so we can quietly get the marriage license filed by Monday morning?" Kendrick did not answer immediately. He walked slowly toward the massive desk and silently dropped a single crisp piece of printed paper onto the polished mahogany surface. It was the certified wire transfer receipt I had confidently handed to his high-priced corporate lawyers just an hour earlier in my apartment hallway. Calvin aggressively snatched the paper off the desk, his eyes scanning the bold black text. "What the hell is this?" he yelled, his frustration boiling over. "A wire transfer for $250,000. Are you seriously telling me that ghetto maid actually managed to somehow forge a certified bank document? Did your lawyers not immediately call the police on her for blatant fraud?" "It is not a forgery, Dad," Kendrick whispered, his voice cracking horribly. "The lawyers officially verified the funds. The money is entirely real. The transfer went through immediately, and our escrow account has been fully credited. The lawsuit is completely dead. We have absolutely no legal leverage left to force Nia to come back." Calvin stared blankly at the receipt, his mind completely refusing to process the impossible information. How he demanded, his voice rising to a frantic, panicked shout. "How does a woman who scrubbed dirty hotel floors have $250,000 in pure liquid cash sitting around? Who actually sent this money, Kendrick?" Kendrick pointed a shaking finger at the bottom of the printed page. "Apex Equity Partners," he answered, his voice trembling with genuine fear. "The sister Desiree. She claimed she is the sole founder and CEO of that private equity firm. She claimed she built it from the ground up. She practically laughed in my face, Dad. She said that $250,000 was absolute pocket change to her." Calvin collapsed back into his leather chair as if he had been physically struck by a heavy baseball bat. The sudden shocking revelation was entirely too much for his highly stressed mind to handle. The quiet, unassuming woman he had aggressively mocked, violently humiliated, and purposefully seated by the noisy catering kitchen was not a broke, uneducated maid. She was the massive financial backing behind Apex Equity Partners, and he had just foolishly declared a brutal, all-out war against her. "We are completely finished," Kendrick whispered, sinking into a nearby guest chair, holding his head in his hands. "We have no money, we have no new loans. The banks are going to foreclose on the dealerships by the end of the month. We are going to lose the house. Mom is going to lose her mind." Calvin stared blindly at the wall, his breathing shallow and rapid. He was a cornered rat trapped in a burning building. His pristine public image was currently being violently torn to shreds by his own reckless actions. He had absolutely nowhere left to turn. No rich friends to casually borrow from because they all secretly hated him. No additional assets to illegally leverage because he had already secretly mortgaged them twice. And then suddenly, with a sharp, cheerful chime, Calvin's private desktop computer softly dinged, indicating a highly prioritized incoming email. Calvin slowly turned his heavy head toward the glowing monitor. Normally, he would actively ignore all incoming messages, completely terrified of opening another vicious threat from a massive collection agency. But the specific subject line of this particular email was written in bold red letters that instantly commanded his absolute undivided attention. Subject line: immediate offer, regarding $15 million commercial debt portfolio. Calvin practically threw himself across the massive desk, aggressively grabbing his computer mouse and frantically clicking on the unread message. His eyes darted rapidly across the crisp professional text on the screen. He read the first paragraph. Then he read it again, his jaw slowly dropping open in utter absolute disbelief. It was a highly formal, direct communication from the executive acquisitions team at Apex Equity Partners. The email explicitly stated that their elusive anonymous CEO had been closely monitoring Pierce Motors. It stated that Apex Equity was currently highly interested in aggressively expanding their commercial real estate portfolio in the greater Atlanta area. And most importantly, it offered a direct, immediate lifeline. Apex Equity was formally proposing to completely buy out Calvin's massive $15 million toxic debt, completely restructuring his failing loans and injecting massive new capital into his struggling business. The email concluded with a highly exclusive invitation. The CEO of Apex Equity Partners wished to personally meet with Calvin Pierce tomorrow evening at exactly 7 o'clock at the most expensive Michelin star restaurant in the exclusive Buckhead district to formally discuss the massive buyout and physically sign the restructuring contracts. Calvin began to laugh. It started as a low, desperate chuckle and quickly evolved into a loud, hysterical, booming roar of absolute pure joy. He slapped his hands violently against his mahogany desk, entirely ignoring Kendrick, who was staring at him like he had finally lost his mind. "Look at this, Kendrick!" Calvin shouted, spinning the computer monitor around so his confused son could read the glowing screen. "Look at this magnificent offer. I told you I am an absolute genius. I told you I am completely untouchable in this city." Kendrick squinted at the screen, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Dad," he said, slowly pointing at the sender address. "This is from Apex Equity Partners. That is the exact same company Desiree just used to wire us the lawsuit settlement money. Are you completely insane? She is the CEO. This has to be a vicious trap." Calvin aggressively waved his hand, completely dismissing his son's extremely valid concerns with his usual blind arrogance. "Do not be a naive idiot, Kendrick," he scoffed aggressively, straightening his wrinkled suit jacket and instantly regaining his toxic false confidence. "That ghetto maid is not the CEO of a massive multi-million-dollar private equity firm. She probably just works as a low-level secretary for the actual billionaire in charge. She probably begged her wealthy boss for a small advance on her miserable salary to bail out your runaway bride." Calvin puffed out his chest, his massive ego instantly re-inflating to its full dangerous capacity. "The real CEO is obviously a brilliant, wealthy businessman who clearly recognizes my immense value and my massive corporate potential in this city," Calvin declared proudly. "He sees that my dealerships are a prime investment opportunity. He wants to partner with a true titan of the Atlanta elite." Kendrick still looked highly doubtful, but he was entirely too weak and cowardly to actively argue with his deeply delusional father. "So what are we going to do?" Kendrick asked nervously. "We are going to that dinner meeting tomorrow night," Calvin announced, a greedy, cruel smile spreading rapidly across his face. "Tell your mother to put on her absolute best designer dress and her most expensive diamonds. We are going to walk into that high-end restaurant looking like absolute royalty. We are going to charm this mysterious billionaire investor, sign the massive buyout paperwork, and completely save our family empire." Calvin Pierce was absolutely ecstatic. He genuinely believed his superior intellect and his fake high society charm had successfully snatched massive victory from the terrifying jaws of total defeat. He had absolutely no idea that he was not walking into a highly lucrative corporate rescue mission. He was happily, eagerly, and blindly walking straight into a perfectly designed financial slaughterhouse. And I was going to be the one holding the blade. The following evening, the oppressive Georgia heat broke slightly as the sun dipped below the Atlanta skyline. Inside the heavily mortgaged Pierce estate, the atmosphere was anything but cool. Calvin was tearing through his massive walk-in closet, acting like an absolute tyrant. He aggressively tossed expensive silk ties and custom-tailored jackets onto the floor, completely dissatisfied with everything he touched. He needed to look like a man who was already a billionaire, not a man desperately begging one for a financial lifeline. Vivian Pierce was sitting rigidly at her expansive marble vanity, applying her third layer of heavy, expensive foundation to mask the dark stress circles under her eyes. She had spent the entire afternoon at the luxury salon preparing for this highly exclusive dinner. Calvin had aggressively mandated that she wear her most expensive outfit, specifically choosing a dark emerald green designer gown that screamed generational wealth. He even forced her to unlock her secure wall safe and put on the massive diamond choker he had bought her 5 years ago using highly illegal corporate funds. Kendrick was pacing nervously in the grand hallway downstairs, adjusting his platinum Rolex watch every few seconds. He was still deeply haunted by the terrifying cold look in my eyes when I had handed over that certified wire transfer receipt. He had desperately tried to convince his father that the Apex equity meeting was a massive dangerous trap, but Calvin had violently shut him down, threatening to completely cut him out of the family will if he dared to ruin this golden opportunity with his pathetic, cowardly whining. The stakes were incredibly high. This single dinner meeting at a famous Michelin star restaurant in the wealthy Buckhead district was the absolute last chance for the Pierce family. If Calvin could successfully charm the mysterious CEO into signing the $15 million debt buyout, their fake luxury empire would miraculously survive. If he failed, the commercial banks would legally seize his dealerships by the end of the week. When the massive black luxury vehicle finally pulled up to the valet stand outside the elegant establishment, Calvin stepped out feeling a massive surge of toxic false confidence. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket and proudly offered his arm to Vivian. They walked through the heavy, ornate glass doors of the restaurant like conquering royalty, completely ignoring the valet attendant who politely greeted them. The interior of the restaurant was breathtakingly opulent. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the plush velvet booths and the polished mahogany bar. The air was thick with the scent of expensive truffles, highly aged imported wine, and the quiet hum of the true Atlanta elite discussing multi-million-dollar corporate deals. This was a place where reservations were notoriously booked 6 months in advance, and the average dinner bill easily exceeded most people's monthly rent. Calvin marched directly up to the polished marble host stand, where a tall, impeccably dressed maitre d' stood with perfect posture. "Good evening," Calvin boomed, his voice intentionally loud enough for the nearby wealthy patrons to clearly hear him. "I am Calvin Pierce. I am here for a highly exclusive private dinner meeting with the CEO of Apex Equity Partners. We have the VIP boardroom reserved for the entire evening." The maitre d' offered a polite, highly trained smile and quickly checked his digital tablet. "Ah yes, Mr. Pierce," the maitre d' replied smoothly. "The VIP boardroom is indeed fully prepared for your party. The CEO has actually already arrived and is currently waiting in the private lounge area just down the hall. If you will please follow me, I can escort your family back there immediately." Calvin puffed out his chest, incredibly pleased that the billionaire investor had arrived early to eagerly wait for him. He turned to Vivian and Kendrick, offering them a smug, victorious smirk. "Let us go secure our massive family legacy," Calvin whispered aggressively. But before they could take a single step toward the private hallway, Vivian suddenly gasped loudly. Her manicured hand flew up to violently clutch her expensive diamond choker, her eyes widening in absolute horror as she stared past the maitre d' toward the elegant waiting area near the front lobby. Sitting quietly on a plush velvet sofa, casually sipping a glass of sparkling water, was me. I had completely discarded the cheap navy blue department store dress. Thanks to the massive corporate black card sitting in my purse, I was currently wearing a sharp, custom-tailored slate gray designer suit that fit me with absolute terrifying perfection. The incredibly crisp lines of the expensive fabric projected an aura of cold, undeniable authority. My hair was styled in a sleek, highly professional cut, and I wore no flashy jewelry, simply a single elegant luxury watch that subtly commanded absolute respect from anyone who truly understood wealth. I looked up from my glass of water and made direct, unwavering eye contact with Vivian Pierce. Vivian's face instantly contorted into a deeply ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. All of her highly polished high society manners completely vanished in a single chaotic second. She aggressively shoved past her husband and marched directly toward me, her expensive emerald gown swishing loudly against the polished marble floor. "What in the absolute hell are you doing here?" Vivian screamed, her shrill voice echoing violently through the elegant restaurant lobby, completely shattering the quiet, sophisticated atmosphere. Dozens of wealthy patrons immediately stopped talking and turned their heads to stare at the sudden, chaotic commotion. I did not stand up. I did not flinch. I simply took another slow, calm sip of my sparkling water and arched a single perfectly groomed eyebrow. "Good evening, Vivian," I said, my voice low, smooth, and entirely unbothered. "You are looking incredibly stressed tonight. Is the crushing weight of massive debt finally getting to you?" Vivian let out a loud, dramatic gasp of pure outrage. "You psychotic ghetto stalker," she shrieked, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "You are absolutely obsessed with us. You found out we were having a highly important business dinner here tonight and you completely followed us." Calvin and Kendrick quickly rushed over to join the loud, aggressive spectacle. When Calvin saw me sitting there looking incredibly expensive and completely relaxed, his face turned an unhealthy shade of purple. He genuinely believed I was there to desperately beg for the $250,000 back. He aggressively assumed I had stalked them to cause another massive public scene to ruin his crucial billionaire meeting. "Listen to me, you pathetic little maid," Calvin growled, stepping dangerously close to my sofa, trying vainly to use his physical size to aggressively intimidate me. "I do not know how you managed to sneak into a high-class establishment like this, but you need to pack up your cheap act and get out right now. We are about to have a private dinner with a highly influential billionaire investor. If you dare to ruin this for my family, I will personally see to it that you are locked in a jail cell for the rest of your miserable life." I slowly placed my crystal water glass down on the small marble coffee table in front of me. I calmly crossed my legs, brushing an invisible speck of dust from my tailored suit pants. "I am not going anywhere, Calvin," I replied, staring directly into his furious, panicked eyes. "I happen to have a very important dinner reservation here myself tonight." Vivian completely lost what little remained of her fragile mind. She turned around wildly and began aggressively snapping her fingers at the tall maitre d' who had rushed over to try and peacefully de-escalate the massive loud situation. "You there!" Vivian yelled at the restaurant employee, completely treating him like a lowly servant. "Call your security guards immediately and physically throw this disgusting woman out onto the street. She is aggressively stalking my family. She does not belong in a luxury place like this. Look at her. She is probably planning to violently rob your wealthy customers or beg them for spare change." The maitre d' looked incredibly uncomfortable, but he maintained his strict professional composure. "Madam, please lower your voice," he requested politely, trying to keep the other wealthy guests from feeling disturbed. "I assure you there is no need for security. We do not tolerate any form of harassment in our establishment." "Then do your damn job and kick this trash out right now," Kendrick aggressively chimed in, stepping forward to try and look like a tough, protective man in front of the watching crowd. "She is dangerously harassing us. We are VIP guests. We are currently meeting the CEO of Apex Equity here tonight. If you do not remove her immediately, my father will personally make sure you lose your job, and this entire restaurant gets shut down." Calvin fiercely nodded his head. He crossed his arms over his chest, eagerly anticipating the immediate arrival of the heavy security guards. He expected the restaurant staff to instantly comply with his aggressive demands. He genuinely believed that his fake wealthy status provided him with an impenetrable shield of authority in this city. He stood there puffing out his chest, looking entirely ridiculous in his custom-tailored tuxedo, while Vivian continued to shoot venomous glares in my direction. They were highly prepared to watch me get violently dragged out of the elegant lobby in disgrace. Before Calvin could utter another toxic threat, the frosted glass doors leading to the main dining room swung wide open. The general manager of the exclusive restaurant, an impeccably groomed older gentleman named Mr. Sterling, walked briskly toward our chaotic little circle. He was flanked by two highly intimidating men in dark suits, who looked like top-tier private security. Vivian spotted the manager approaching and quickly stood up taller, her massive diamond choker catching the bright overhead light as she prepared to loudly demand my immediate forceful removal. "Mr. Sterling, thank goodness you are finally here," Vivian declared, her shrill voice dripping with toxic elite entitlement. "Your front desk staff is completely incompetent. We are important VIP guests, meeting an incredibly wealthy billionaire here tonight, and this wretched homeless woman is aggressively stalking my family. I want her physically dragged out of this establishment immediately." Mr. Sterling did not apologize profusely. He did not nod his head and call for his security team to grab my arms. In fact, he completely ignored Vivian Pierce as if she were entirely invisible. He walked directly past the furious, deeply confused Pierce family, completely bypassing Calvin's aggressive stance. He stopped directly in front of the plush velvet sofa where I was comfortably sitting. Mr. Sterling smoothly adjusted the front of his tailored suit jacket and bowed deeply, showing me a level of profound, genuine respect that the Pierce family had never received in their miserable, fake lives. "Right this way, Madam CEO," he announced, his voice projecting clearly across the suddenly quiet lobby. "Your private boardroom is completely ready for you." The absolute dead silence that immediately followed his highly respectful words was physically deafening. The wealthy patrons who had been eagerly watching the commotion suddenly froze their expensive wine glasses, halting halfway to their lips. The entire atmosphere of the lobby shifted dramatically in a single chaotic second. Vivian Pierce looked as if someone had violently slapped her across her heavily powdered face with a solid brick. Her mouth dropped wide open in a highly unattractive display of pure, unadulterated shock. She looked wildly back and forth between the deferential general manager and the calm, collected woman sitting comfortably on the velvet sofa. Her toxic high society armor instantly shattered, leaving her completely exposed and wildly confused. Kendrick stumbled backward, bumping heavily into a nearby polished marble pillar. His eyes grew incredibly wide with sheer, terrifying panic. He remembered the certified wire transfer receipt I had handed to his high-priced lawyers. He remembered my cold, specific warning in the hallway of my apartment. He finally fully realized that his incredibly arrogant father had proudly marched them all straight into a massive, inescapable financial death trap. Kendrick looked at Calvin, his face completely drained of color, and quietly whispered, "I warned you, Dad. I told you she was the CEO." Calvin Pierce stood entirely frozen, his arrogant, aggressive posture rapidly collapsing, like a poorly constructed house of cards. His desperate brain was violently short-circuiting frantically, trying to process the completely impossible, terrifying reality unfolding right in front of his widening eyes. He looked at my sharp designer suit, noting the flawless tailoring. He looked at the respectful general manager waiting patiently for my command, and then he looked directly at my face. I was not a poor, uneducated maid begging for a few spare dollars. I was the absolute apex predator waiting patiently in the tall grass, and he had willingly, happily walked directly into my waiting jaws. All of his illegal financial schemes, all of his desperate hopes to secretly save his failing luxury car dealerships rested entirely in my hands. The woman he had aggressively mocked, the woman he had cruelly placed by the noisy catering kitchen at his son's wedding, was the exact same billionaire investor he was desperately hoping to manipulate. I slowly stood up from the soft velvet sofa, casually buttoning the front of my tailored slate gray blazer. I did not look at Vivian, who was currently hyperventilating softly. I did not acknowledge Kendrick's pathetic whimpering. I looked directly into Calvin's deeply panicked, horrified eyes and offered him a slow, terrifyingly cold smile. "After you, Mr. Pierce," I said, gesturing politely but firmly toward the elegant hallway leading to the exclusive private dining rooms. "We have a massive amount of important corporate business to discuss tonight." I turned away from his horrified face and began walking confidently down the long hallway, closely followed by Mr. Sterling and the two security guards. For a long, agonizing, tense moment, the Pierce family simply stood there in the lobby, completely paralyzed by the crushing magnitude of their monumental mistake. They had two terrifying choices. They could turn around, run out the front glass doors, and guarantee their absolute total financial ruin by the end of the week when the commercial bank seized everything they owned. Or they could swallow every ounce of their massive pride and obediently follow the very woman they had relentlessly abused directly into the execution chamber. The heavy, terrified, slow footsteps echoing softly behind me quickly confirmed they had desperately chosen the latter. I walked through the beautifully decorated restaurant with the absolute total confidence of a woman who completely owned the entire building. The VIP boardroom was located at the very back of the establishment, heavily guarded by thick, soundproof mahogany doors. Mr. Sterling stepped forward respectfully and smoothly pulled the double doors open, gesturing politely for me to enter first. The private room was a masterpiece of modern luxury and intense corporate intimidation. A massive rectangular table carved from a single exquisite slab of dark imported wood dominated the exact center of the space. High-backed premium leather chairs lined the sides of the long table, but there was only one true seat of absolute power in the room. The commanding chair sitting directly at the very head of the table. I walked directly to the head of the table and took my seat. I casually placed my thick leather financial portfolio on the polished wood and leaned back, resting my hands comfortably on the expensive leather armrests. A few seconds later, Calvin, Vivian, and Kendrick slowly shuffled into the private boardroom, looking exactly like terrified prisoners walking their final heavy steps toward the electric chair. Mr. Sterling quietly closed the heavy mahogany doors behind them, instantly sealing us inside the completely soundproof room. The loud, lively noise of the main restaurant was violently cut off, leaving only the suffocating thick silence of impending total doom. Vivian looked entirely stripped of her fake high society confidence. She clutched her expensive diamond choker tightly, her hands trembling so violently that the heavy jewels audibly rattled against her collarbone. She could not bring herself to look me directly in the eye. The arrogant elite woman who had proudly commanded me to eat my dinner in the dark corner was now standing nervously before me, desperately waiting for my explicit permission to even pull out a chair. Kendrick looked physically ill, his handsome face covered in a cold, clammy sweat. He kept anxiously darting his eyes toward the locked heavy doors, desperately wishing he could magically escape the brutal, terrifying reality of his own making. But Calvin was the one currently experiencing the most profound, absolute psychological torture. The arrogant car dealership owner stood awkwardly at the opposite end of the massive long table, staring at me with a look of pure, devastated total horror. His $15 million massive lifeline, his highly anticipated golden ticket out of crushing corporate debt, was sitting right in front of him. The realization that he had actively mocked the only person who could save his family from absolute poverty was actively destroying his mind. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as he stared at the thick leather portfolio sitting directly in front of me, knowing it contained his total destruction. The pristine, dark wood table was perfectly set with heavy crystal water goblets, imported silver cutlery, and crisp white linen napkins. A perfectly chilled, elegant glass pitcher of water rested near my right hand. I did not speak immediately. I actively chose to let the heavy, oppressive, terrifying silence torture them for a few long, agonizing minutes. I let them stand there, fully absorbing the complete, absolute reversal of extreme power. They had spent years aggressively looking down on my sister and me, intentionally treating us like disposable trash, simply because we did not naturally come from their fake, wealthy world. They had actively tried to ruin my sister's highly promising legal career with a completely fraudulent, massive civil lawsuit. Now they were entirely, completely dependent on my absolute ultimate mercy. And I had absolutely zero mercy left to give to any of them. I slowly reached out with a perfectly steady hand and picked up the heavy crystal pitcher, calmly and deliberately pouring myself a glass of sparkling water. The gentle, crisp splashing sound of the cold liquid hitting the heavy crystal glass was the absolute only noise in the perfectly silent, highly tense room. I carefully set the heavy pitcher back down, picked up my glass, and took a slow, highly deliberate, refreshing sip. The cool water felt incredibly satisfying against my throat. I gently placed the crystal glass back onto the polished wooden table, folding my hands neatly over the top of my thick leather portfolio. I looked directly down the massive, long, dark table, locking my cold, entirely unwavering gaze with Calvin's terrified, desperate, pleading eyes. "Have a seat, Calvin," I commanded, my voice slicing cleanly through the heavy, thick silence like a razor-sharp corporate blade. "Let us discuss your bankruptcy." Calvin Pierce stared at me from the opposite end of the long mahogany table. His face twitched as he desperately tried to process my command. The absolute sheer terror in his eyes slowly began to morph back into his familiar toxic arrogance. His fragile ego simply could not accept the terrifying reality staring him directly in the face. He let out a loud, forced laugh that echoed awkwardly against the soundproof walls of the private VIP boardroom. It was a hollow, desperate sound. "You are incredibly amusing," Desiree Calvin said forcefully, pulling out one of the heavy leather chairs and sitting down. He unbuttoned his custom tuxedo jacket and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. I have to admit, this is a highly elaborate prank. You actually paid off the restaurant staff to let you sit in here, did you not? You are probably just a low-level secretary or a personal assistant to the actual billionaire CEO. So why do you not stop playing this ridiculous little game, go fetch us some expensive wine, and tell your boss that Calvin Pierce is ready to sign the paperwork? Vivian immediately clung to her husband's desperate delusion, like a drowning woman grabbing a life raft. Yes, of course. Vivian breathed a massive sigh of relief, finally pulling out her own chair. She is just the help. I knew a woman who scrubbed filthy hotel floors could never build a massive private equity firm. You almost gave me a terrible heart attack, Calvin. Tell this arrogant maid to get out of our sight before the real billionaire investor arrives and sees her sitting in his chair. I did not laugh. I did not raise my voice or aggressively defend my legitimate corporate position. I simply let them bask in their pathetic, comforting delusion for exactly 5 more seconds. Then I reached forward and unzipped the top of my thick leather financial portfolio. I pulled out 3 massive, tightly bound dossiers. These were not standard corporate reports. They were highly detailed, aggressive forensic accounting files, meticulously compiled by my elite team of financial analysts over the past 48 hours. Every single page contained the brutal, undeniable truth of Calvin's fraudulent empire. I placed my hands firmly on top of the thick stacks and shoved them forcefully down the length of the polished wooden table. The 3 heavy dossiers slid smoothly across the pristine surface, coming to a sudden harsh stop directly in front of Calvin, Vivian, and Kendrick. The loud, heavy thud made Kendrick physically jump in his seat. I am not the secretary, Calvin. I said, my voice completely devoid of any human emotion. I am the executioner. And those files sitting right in front of you are your official corporate death warrants. I highly suggest you open them. Calvin glared at me, his jaw clenched tight, but his trembling hands betrayed his massive internal panic. He slowly reached out and flipped open the heavy black cover of the first dossier. Vivian leaned over his shoulder, her eyes squinting at the dense columns of complex financial data. Kendrick reluctantly opened his own copy, staring blankly at the highly detailed spreadsheets. Let us begin on page 4. I instructed calmly, leaning back in my powerful leather chair. You have been aggressively projecting the image of a highly successful automotive mogul for the past 10 years. But according to your actual federal tax returns, you have not turned a legitimate profit since 2018. You have been actively bleeding money for 6 consecutive years, Calvin. Calvin's face immediately lost all of its remaining color. He stared at the page, completely paralyzed, as he saw his own highly classified tax documents staring right back at him. Turn to page 12. I continued, my voice echoing with brutal corporate authority. This is where it gets incredibly interesting for the federal authorities. In order to aggressively hide your massive financial bleeding, you successfully opened 4 highly illegal offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands under a deeply buried shell corporation. You have been systematically funneling millions of dollars of untaxed revenue into those hidden accounts, while simultaneously claiming massive corporate losses in the state of Georgia. That is not just poor business management, Calvin. That is textbook federal tax evasion. The Internal Revenue Service normally hands out 20-year federal prison sentences for this exact level of deliberate financial fraud. Vivian let out a sharp, terrified gasp, violently pulling away from the terrifying document as if it were covered in poison. Calvin, you told me everything was perfectly fine, she whispered, her voice cracking with pure panic. You told me those accounts were completely legal overseas investments. Shut up, Vivian, Calvin hissed viciously, his eyes darting frantically across the damning pages. This is entirely fabricated. She illegally hacked into my private servers and completely fabricated these fake documents to ruin my public reputation. I ignored his pathetic lying and moved directly to the final devastating blow. Skip forward to page 36, I commanded softly. This is my absolute favorite part of your highly creative financial fiction. Kendrick frantically flipped through the thick pages of his dossier, his breathing becoming incredibly ragged and shallow. He stopped on page 36 and his eyes widened in absolute horror. In order to desperately secure the new federal business loans you needed to keep your fake luxury empire afloat, you wildly inflated your physical vehicle inventory, I explained, watching the absolute devastation completely wash over them. You officially claim to have over 400 luxury imported vehicles sitting safely on your commercial lots. But my private investigators physically audited all 3 of your dealership locations yesterday morning. You barely have 80 functional cars, Calvin. The rest are completely ghost assets. You literally forged hundreds of vehicle identification numbers to secure massive federal loans. You are actively running a massive $15 million financial Ponzi scheme. The heavy, soundproof boardroom was so quiet I could actually hear Calvin's ragged, desperate breathing. He was completely trapped. The highly classified evidence was utterly undeniable. He knew with absolute certainty that if I simply handed these thick dossiers over to the federal banking authorities, he would completely lose his business, his massive mansion, and his entire freedom. And that is exactly why you desperately needed my sister, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. You did not want Nia to marry your pathetic son. You wanted a brilliant, debt-free lawyer with pristine credit to blindly co-sign your highly fraudulent federal loan applications. You wanted to completely destroy her beautiful, bright future to selfishly save your own miserable skin. Calvin buried his face in his trembling hands, entirely unable to look at me. His massive, fragile ego had been violently, systematically crushed into absolute dust. Vivian was openly sobbing in her chair, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks, completely ruining her precious high society image. The self-proclaimed untouchable royalty of the Atlanta black elite had been utterly destroyed in less than 10 minutes. But Kendrick was not ready to surrender. He had spent his entire pathetic life hiding safely behind his father's massive fake shadow, entirely shielded from the harsh, brutal consequences of the real world. He genuinely believed that his family still possessed some magical, untouchable power that could instantly fix this terrifying nightmare. Kendrick suddenly pushed his chair back with a loud, aggressive scrape against the hardwood floor. He jumped to his feet, puffing out his chest and violently pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. He was desperately trying to play the role of the dominant alpha male, but he just looked like a terrified, angry little boy. You think you can just walk in here and violently threaten us with these fake illegal documents? Kendrick shouted, his voice echoing loudly in the private room. You are absolutely out of your mind, Desiree. You are nothing but a jealous, bitter maid. We are the Pierce family. We literally built this entire city. We are completely untouchable in Atlanta. I casually took another slow sip of my sparkling water, entirely unbothered by his loud, childish temper tantrum. Are you entirely finished, Kendrick? I asked politely. No, I am not finished, Kendrick yelled frantically, reaching into his expensive tailored suit jacket and aggressively pulling out his sleek cell phone. You made a massive mistake coming here tonight. You forgot exactly who we are connected to. I am going to call the mayor of Atlanta right now. He is a very close personal friend of my family. He plays golf with my father every single weekend. When I tell him that you are actively trying to aggressively extort us with stolen documents, he will personally send his private police task force to arrest you and throw you in federal prison forever. Calvin looked up from his hands, his eyes flashing with a tiny pathetic glimmer of desperate hope. He desperately wanted to believe that his high-level political connections could somehow magically erase the massive $15 million mountain of absolute undeniable fraud sitting on the table. Kendrick aggressively unlocked his screen and aggressively tapped the screen, dialing the private personal number of the mayor of Atlanta. He held the expensive phone up to his ear, staring at me with a look of pure toxic triumph. He genuinely believed he had just completely outsmarted the billionaire CEO of Apex Equity. I slowly smiled. It was a cold, calculated, terrifying smile that made Kendrick's false confidence instantly shatter. I leaned forward, resting my chin gracefully on my folded hands. By all means, Kendrick, I said, my voice dripping with dark, lethal amusement. Call your close personal friend. But do me a small favor. Since we are all sitting here in this lovely private boardroom together, put the phone on speaker. I want to hear exactly what the mayor has to say to the untouchable Pierce family. Kendrick tapped the glowing speaker icon on his screen with a defiant, highly exaggerated thrust of his finger. He placed the sleek phone directly in the center of the dark mahogany table, right next to the damning forensic dossiers. The loud, rhythmic ringing echoed through the soundproof boardroom. One ring, two rings. Calvin leaned forward slightly, desperately clinging to the foolish hope that his powerful political ally would swiftly swoop in to save his crumbling empire. On the third ring, a frantic, breathless voice answered. "Kendrick, it is about damn time you called." Kendrick instantly puffed out his chest, his arrogant smirk returning in full force. He looked directly at me, expecting me to cower in fear. "Mr. Mayor," Kendrick said smoothly, his voice dripping with toxic entitlement, "I am currently sitting here with my father. We have a highly urgent situation. There is a deeply disturbed woman here, actively trying to aggressively extort our family with forged financial documents. We need you to immediately send your private task force to have her arrested." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed immediately by a loud, chaotic sound of heavy filing cabinets slamming shut in the background. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Kendrick the mayor practically screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unfiltered panic. "Do not ever call this secure number again. Do you hear me? Never." Kendrick blinked in utter confusion, his confident smirk instantly vanishing. "Mr. Mayor, what are you talking about? It is us. The Pierces." "I know exactly who it is, you absolute idiot," the mayor roared, completely abandoning his polished political composure. "Do you have any idea what is happening at City Hall right now? Federal auditors just aggressively raided my administrative offices. They marched in with official federal subpoenas demanding every single email, every single zoning permit, and every single tax record directly related to Pierce Motors. Your father has been running a massive illegal Ponzi scheme, and the federal government is actively pulling the plug as we speak." Calvin let out a choked, terrifying gasp, reaching out to grab the edge of the heavy wooden table to keep himself from physically collapsing. The mayor was not finished. His panicked voice echoed loudly, filling the tense boardroom with absolute destruction. "I spent the last 3 hours frantically shredding every single piece of correspondence I ever had with your fraudulent family." The mayor confessed, his voice shaking with absolute terror. "I will not let Calvin drag my entire political career down into federal prison with him. As of right now, I do not know you. I do not know your father. The Pierce family is officially dead in this city. Do not ever contact me again." A sharp, loud click was immediately followed by the hollow, empty sound of a dead dial tone. Kendrick stood frozen, staring down at his phone as if it had suddenly transformed into a venomous snake. The ultimate, untouchable shield of the Atlanta Black elite had just violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Their most powerful political ally had completely abandoned them, running for his own life from the massive financial storm I had quietly unleashed. Calvin slumped heavily back into his leather chair, all the fight completely drained from his massive frame. His eyes were wide empty and entirely devoid of his usual toxic arrogance. He was officially a completely defeated man. Before the suffocating silence could fully settle over the terrified Pierce family, the heavy mahogany doors of the VIP boardroom suddenly swung open. Aunt Yvonne confidently strutted into the private room, wearing a bright, highly obnoxious yellow dress that aggressively clashed with the elegant, sophisticated decor. Vivian had intentionally invited her to this highly exclusive dinner, specifically to give Yvonne a front-row seat to mock me. Yvonne fully expected to walk in and see me crying, desperately begging a powerful billionaire for my old job back. Instead, she walked into an absolute corporate slaughterhouse. Yvonne stopped dead in her tracks, her smug, confident smile instantly freezing on her heavily contoured face. She looked at Vivian, who was actively weeping into her hands. She looked at Calvin, who was staring blankly at the wall like a terrifyingly broken man. She looked at Kendrick, who was physically shaking with pure fear. And then her eyes slowly traveled down the massive length of the dark polished table, landing directly on me. I was comfortably sitting in the ultimate seat of absolute power, a pitcher of sparkling water by my side, and 3 massive forensic dossiers scattered in front of my defeated enemies. The heavily armed private security guards stationed just outside the door were clearly there to protect me, not to aggressively throw me out. Vivian looked up her ruined mascara, making her look like a terrifying, desperate ghoul. Yvonne Vivian practically sobbed, reaching a shaking hand out toward my aunt. Thank God you are here. You have to help us. Desiree is a complete monster. She illegally hacked our private corporate accounts. She is aggressively trying to violently destroy our entire family. Tell her to stop, Yvonne. Tell your niece to call off the federal authorities. Aunt Yvonne was a deeply greedy, toxic woman, but she possessed a highly tuned instinct for absolute survival. She instantly assessed the shifting power dynamics in the room. She saw the massive, undeniable wealth radiating from my custom-tailored suit. She saw the sheer, unadulterated terror completely consuming the fake billionaire family she had foolishly aligned herself with. Yvonne's survival instinct violently kicked in. She did not rush over to comfort her crying high society friend. Instead, she aggressively slapped Vivian's outstretched hand away with a loud, sharp smack. "Do not you dare touch me! Vivian!" Yvonne shouted, her voice echoing sharply in the tense room. "Do not you dare speak about my brilliant niece that way!" Vivian recoiled in absolute shock, entirely unable to process the sudden violent betrayal. "Yvonne, what are you doing?" Vivian gasped. "We are best friends. We paid you for that exclusive blog interview." Yvonne violently pointed a finger directly at Vivian's face, aggressively throwing her completely under the corporate bus without a single second of hesitation. "You manipulated me! You toxic, evil woman!" Yvonne shrieked, adopting the fake role of a deeply wronged victim. "You aggressively forced me to say those terrible lies to that gossip blog. You viciously threatened me. You told me you would ruin my social standing in the church if I did not publicly attack Desiree." Yvonne quickly turned toward me, her face instantly contorting into a mask of desperate, pathetic pleading. She practically ran down the length of the long table, stopping just a few feet away from my powerful chair. She clasped her hands tightly together, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Desiree, my sweet, beautiful niece," Yvonne practically begged, her voice trembling with highly manufactured emotion. "You have to believe me. I never wanted to hurt you or Nia. You are my own flesh and blood. I always knew these disgusting Pierces were evil, corrupt people. I always secretly defended you. Please, Desiree, you have to forgive your favorite aunt. We are family." I looked at Yvonne, her bright yellow dress practically burning my eyes. Watching her desperately scramble to change sides, watching her completely abandon her wealthy friends, the exact second their fake ship started rapidly sinking, was entirely pathetic. It was the exact same toxic, opportunistic behavior she had eagerly displayed when our parents died. I did not smile. I did not offer her a warm, comforting hug. I calmly reached my hand back into my thick leather financial portfolio. "You have an incredibly fascinating definition of the word family, Yvonne," I said, my voice completely flat and terrifyingly cold. "You claim you love your nieces. You claim you always actively supported us. But my extensive corporate memory recalls a drastically different version of history." I pulled out a single thin manila folder. It was drastically smaller than the massive dossiers I had handed to Calvin, but the highly classified documents inside were just as lethal. I tossed the thin folder onto the polished mahogany table, letting it slide smoothly until it stopped right in front of Yvonne's violently shaking hands. "Open it," I commanded softly. Yvonne swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward the folder. She reached out with trembling fingers and slowly lifted the cover. Inside were perfectly preserved high-definition photocopies of bank wire transfers, forged legal signatures, and the original official life insurance policy documents from exactly 10 years ago. "You spent the last decade proudly bragging to your church friends about your massive financial independence," I stated, watching the remaining color rapidly drain from her highly contoured face. "You happily told everyone that you built your life through extremely hard work. But the absolute brutal truth is that you viciously stole a $100,000 life insurance payout from two grieving, orphaned teenagers. You deliberately forged my signature on the primary beneficiary release forms while I was too busy planning our parents' funeral to actively notice your massive federal fraud." Yvonne started to violently shake her head, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. No, Desiree. That was a massive misunderstanding. She stammered desperately, backing away from the table. The bank made a massive clerical error. I was going to give you that money. I was just securely holding it for you until you were slightly older. You used it to buy your house in the suburbs, Yvonne. I snapped, my voice suddenly cracking like a sharp, violent whip, making her physically jump. You selfishly bought a house while I was aggressively forced to move my little sister into a deeply dangerous neighborhood. I had to scrub hotel toilets on the midnight shift so she could eat while you were happily hosting luxury summer barbecues. Yvonne pressed her back against the wall, breathing heavily, her eyes darting toward the heavy mahogany doors, desperately searching for a quick escape. But Desiree, it has been 10 solid years, Yvonne cried, her voice taking on a desperate, highly pathetic whine. You cannot legally do anything about it now. The law protects me. The legal statute of limitations for standard insurance fraud has already completely expired. You are far too late. I slowly leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished dark wood, steepling my fingers together. I stared at my aunt with a cold, calculating corporate stare that actively stripped away the last remaining shreds of her false confidence. You are entirely correct, Yvonne, I replied smoothly. The legal statute of limitations for standard state-level insurance fraud is indeed heavily restricted. However, you made a highly critical, devastating mistake when you stole our money. You completely forgot who you were actively dealing with. I reached out and tapped a highly specific line on the top document inside the manila folder. You did not just forge a simple document, Yvonne. I explained, my voice radiating absolute lethal corporate authority. You intentionally moved those stolen funds across state lines using a federally insured commercial banking institution. That highly specific action instantly elevates your pathetic little theft from a standard state crime to massive federal wire fraud. And under federal corporate law, when massive financial fraud is intentionally concealed, the strict statute of limitations does not officially begin until the exact moment the active fraud is finally discovered. Yvonne's jaw dropped open, a tiny pathetic squeak escaping her throat as the terrifying legal reality finally crashed down upon her. My elite corporate lawyers officially discovered your massive concealed fraud exactly 48 hours ago. I concluded, a dark, deeply satisfying smile finally touching my lips. Which means the federal statute of limitations just officially restarted. You are not legally protected, Yvonne. You are completely, entirely exposed. The federal authorities have a massive, highly detailed file with your exact name on it. Yvonne stood completely frozen, her jaw trembling uncontrollably. I gave her exactly 5 seconds to fully process her horrifying new reality. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your cheap plastic bags and permanently leave the state of Georgia, Yvonne, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying, icy whisper. If I ever see your toxic face in the city of Atlanta again, if you ever attempt to contact Nia or post another vicious lie on a local gossip blog, I will personally press send on that federal email. Now get out of my private boardroom before I call my security guards to physically drag you out. Yvonne did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. She turned sharply on her high heels and practically sprinted toward the heavy mahogany doors. She frantically shoved past the large, intimidating security guards stationed outside and quickly disappeared down the elegant hallway, leaving her incredibly wealthy friends entirely behind without a single backward glance. The loud, heavy click of the wooden doors sealing shut signaled the absolute final end of her toxic involvement in our lives. I slowly turned my complete, undivided attention back to the primary targets, sitting nervously across the massive dark table. Vivian was still violently weeping silently into her shaking hands, her expensive diamond choker looking incredibly heavy and entirely ridiculous on her trembling neck. Kendrick was staring blankly at the empty space where Aunt Yvonne had just been standing, completely paralyzed by the sheer breathtaking speed of her brutal betrayal. Calvin was staring blindly at the 3 thick forensic accounting dossiers, his massive chest heaving with shallow, frantic, panicked breaths. I calmly reached into my thick leather portfolio for the absolute final time tonight. I did not pull out another massive, heavy stack of highly classified financial evidence. I pulled out a single crisp, legally binding contract, printed on premium, heavily watermarked corporate paper. I placed it gently on top of the polished mahogany table, right next to my half-empty glass of sparkling water. I reached inside my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek silver luxury pen, placing it directly on top of the crisp document. I slowly pushed the single piece of paper down the massive long table. It glided incredibly smoothly across the pristine dark wood, coming to a sudden harsh stop directly in front of Calvin's shaking hands. He looked down at the printed contract as if it were a highly venomous snake, preparing to aggressively strike his vulnerable throat. "What exactly is this piece of paper?" Calvin whispered, his voice sounding incredibly hollow and completely devoid of its usual arrogant, booming life. "That is your absolute, final corporate ultimatum, Calvin," I replied, my tone completely uncompromising and rigidly professional. That single document is an unconditional transfer of corporate ownership and a direct property deed surrender agreement. By signing that specific paper, you are legally signing over 100% of your massive controlling shares in Pierce Motors directly to Apex Equity Partners. You are also officially surrendering the deed to your heavily mortgaged luxury mansion located in the exclusive Buckhead district. Vivian suddenly let out a loud, horrific, piercing scream, completely dropping her shaking hands from her ruined, tear-stained face. "Our beautiful house!" she shrieked, her shrill voice cracking violently with pure, unadulterated terror. "You absolutely cannot legally take our house. That is my personal home. That is the elegant place where I proudly host all my elite high society church galas. We have comfortably lived there for 20 solid years. You are a completely ruthless, vicious monster, Desiree." I completely ignored her pathetic, frantic, screaming outburst, keeping my cold, unwavering gaze locked firmly on Calvin's rapidly deteriorating pale face. "I am not illegally taking your luxury house, Vivian," I corrected smoothly, my voice easily cutting through her loud, hysterical sobbing. "I am legally seizing a highly leveraged, toxic financial asset that was illegally purchased using heavily stolen corporate funds. Apex Equity already officially owns the valuable commercial land directly beneath your failing dealerships. Tomorrow morning, we will officially own your entirely fraudulent business and the very expensive roof currently sitting over your highly arrogant heads." Calvin slowly reached out with a violently trembling hand, his sweating fingers hovering nervously just a few inches above the sleek, silver luxury pen. "You are completely wiping me out, Desiree." He rasped, his wide eyes rapidly filling with bitter, deeply defeated tears. "You are aggressively leaving me with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. I aggressively built that automotive company from the literal ground up. I am a highly respected, powerful titan of this great city. You simply cannot just easily erase my entire massive legacy with a single piece of paper. Your legacy is a massive $15 million criminal fraud, Calvin." I snapped loudly, my voice echoing sharply off the heavy soundproof walls, making him physically flinch. "And you are incredibly, incredibly lucky I am generously giving you this highly specific alternative. You have exactly until 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to officially sign that contract and completely vacate your massive property. If that signed legal document is not sitting proudly on my corporate desk by the exact time I drink my morning coffee, I will immediately forward all 3 of these highly detailed forensic dossiers directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation." I leaned aggressively forward, resting my elbows heavily on the polished dark wood, ensuring every single terrifying word pierced directly into his deeply panicked soul. "The federal authorities will aggressively raid your luxury dealerships before lunch tomorrow, Calvin. They will violently freeze every single one of your hidden illegal offshore bank accounts located in the Cayman Islands. They will physically drag you out of your massive luxury mansion wearing shiny silver handcuffs, while all of your elite high society neighbors eagerly film the entire deeply humiliating public spectacle on their expensive cell phones. You will not just lose your fake plastic wealth, Calvin. You will lose your total physical freedom. You will spend the next 20 years of your miserable, pathetic life sitting quietly in a cold, dark federal prison cell entirely forgotten by everyone in this city forever." Calvin's physical reaction to the terrifying absolute truth was instantaneous and deeply incredibly terrifying to witness. He suddenly clutched his left hand violently against the exact center of his chest, his dark eyes bulging wildly from their sockets in pure, unadulterated fear. He let out a sharp, agonizing, painful gasp, leaning heavily against the dark mahogany table for desperate physical support. His heavy breathing became incredibly erratic, rapidly transforming into short, shallow, panicked pants as sheer absolute terror completely overwhelmed his rapidly failing cardiovascular system. Dad Kendrick yelled loudly, finally breaking forcefully out of his terrified, paralyzed, frozen state. He rushed quickly over to his father's, shaking side aggressively, grabbing his tailored shoulder. "Dad, are you okay right now? You need to breathe. Just breathe right now. Look at me, please." Calvin simply could not speak a single coherent word. He was actively, aggressively hyperventilating his entire massive frame, shaking violently as the colossal crushing weight of his total complete financial destruction physically crushed his fragile body. His massive fake empire, his deeply arrogant social status, his millions of stolen dollars. It was all entirely completely gone forever. He was absolutely nothing but a broke, desperate, pathetic criminal actively facing decades in a federal prison, and his highly stressed physical body was aggressively shutting down from the massive, overwhelming psychological trauma. Vivian completely, entirely broke down. She violently threw her head back and let out a loud, agonizing, dramatic wail of pure, total, bottomless despair. The absolute devastating realization that her highly exclusive elite socialite life was completely permanently over finally crashed violently down upon her shallow shoulders. There would be absolutely no more expensive Michelin-star dinners in private VIP boardrooms. There would be absolutely no more luxury diamond chokers securely locked in her wall safe. There would be absolutely no more elite church galas where she could proudly look down her surgically enhanced nose at hard-working people she deeply deemed completely beneath her. She was going to be aggressively, mercilessly evicted from her massive luxury mansion and publicly, utterly humiliated in front of the entire wealthy city of Atlanta. She violently buried her tear-stained face in her shaking arms, sobbing uncontrollably hysterically against the polished dark wood of the massive VIP table. Kendrick looked absolutely totally lost. The incredibly arrogant golden boy who had confidently aggressively shown up at my apartment door with two highly paid corporate lawyers just yesterday afternoon was currently watching his entire massive unearned inheritance rapidly burn to absolute ash right before his terrified eyes. He had absolutely no real-world skills. He had absolutely no backup financial plan. He had entirely heavily relied on his father's massive fake wealth to effortlessly carry him through his lazy, entitled life. And now he was completely, undeniably broke. I stood up slowly and carefully from my powerful leather chair, gracefully smoothing the pristine, crisp lines of my custom-tailored slate gray designer suit. I confidently picked up my thick, heavy leather financial portfolio and securely tucked it tightly under my right arm. I did not feel a single solitary ounce of human pity for the incredibly toxic people aggressively sobbing and violently hyperventilating right in front of me. They had actively maliciously chosen to be exceptionally cruel. They had actively aggressively chosen to be viciously blindly greedy. They had actively violently chosen to relentlessly attack my beautiful innocent sister. Now they were simply finally harvesting the bitter, deeply toxic fruit of their own deeply arrogant, selfish actions. The incredibly massive and highly expensive mistake they had proudly made at that luxury wedding reception had finally violently caught up to them. They had foolishly, arrogantly assumed that the quiet, unassuming sister, sitting politely by the noisy catering kitchen, was an incredibly easy, weak target. They had absolutely completely failed to recognize the silent, massive, terrifying storm rapidly approaching their fragile, fake glass house. "Sign the binding corporate contract." "Calvin," I said quietly, my voice cutting cleanly through the loud, chaotic sounds of their deep, pathetic weeping and rapid, terrified hyperventilating. "I highly suggest you deeply enjoy your absolute final night sleeping comfortably in your massive luxury bed. Tomorrow morning, your entirely new, completely broke reality officially begins." I turned my back firmly on the utterly, completely destroyed Pierce family and walked smoothly and confidently toward the heavy mahogany double doors. The tall, imposing security guards immediately respectfully pulled the heavy doors wide open, allowing me to gracefully exit the private VIP boardroom. I walked smoothly and confidently out into the beautifully softly lit restaurant lobby, leaving the entirely shattered, completely ruined remnants of the fake Atlanta elite crying desperately in the absolute dark shadows behind me forever. The morning sun rose brilliantly over the Atlanta skyline, casting a warm, golden glow through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse executive office at Apex Equity Partners. It was exactly 7:55 in the morning. I was standing calmly by the thick glass, holding a warm ceramic mug of freshly brewed black coffee, watching the busy city slowly wake up far below me. I was not anxious. I was not worried about whether Calvin Pierce would actually comply with my strict demands. I knew exactly what absolute financial terror did to a man who had spent his entire fake life hiding behind a highly fragile wall of stolen money. The heavy mahogany doors of my private office swung open smoothly, and Marcus, my brilliant chief operating officer, walked in holding a single crisp corporate document. He did not say a single word. He simply walked directly over to my massive glass desk and placed the contract down on the pristine surface. I walked over and looked closely at the designated signature line. Calvin Pierce had officially signed his name. His once arrogant handwriting was incredibly shaky, barely legible, clearly executed by a man completely broken by sheer, unadulterated terror. But it was entirely legally binding. He had officially, unconditionally surrendered his dealerships and the heavy deed to his luxury mansion. Marcus, I said, taking a slow, highly satisfying sip of my dark coffee. Initiate the massive property seizure immediately. Send the commercial bank auditors directly to all 3 Pierce Motors locations right now. I want every single luxury car locked down, every financial file secured, and every employee officially informed that the Pierce family is permanently removed from the commercial premises. And Marcus, send the primary aggressive eviction team to the Buckhead mansion. I want them physically out of my newly acquired house this exact minute. Marcus smiled a sharp, highly professional smile. The local law enforcement authorities and the commercial moving trucks are already heavily staged, just 2 blocks away from their private gated community, Madam CEO. He confirmed, his voice radiating absolute efficiency. I nodded, setting my ceramic coffee mug down on the glass desk. I grabbed my car keys from the drawer. I wanted to see the absolute final destruction of the fake Atlanta elite with my own 2 eyes. I left my corporate office and drove my dark luxury SUV directly into the highly exclusive Buckhead neighborhood, parking quietly down the beautifully manicured street from the massive Pierce estate. The neighborhood was incredibly peaceful, filled with the soft sounds of chirping birds and expensive landscaping sprinklers. But that quiet high society peace was about to be violently, permanently shattered. At exactly 8:15, a massive fleet of heavy commercial moving trucks, accompanied by 3 fully marked police cruisers, aggressively pulled into the wide circular driveway of the sprawling Pierce mansion. The loud, rumbling diesel engines completely destroyed the quiet, peaceful morning of the highly exclusive neighborhood. I rolled down my tinted window, watching the beautiful, glorious, absolute chaos finally unfold. Heavy men in dark professional uniforms marched aggressively up the grand front steps, pounding loudly on the massive custom double doors. When nobody immediately answered, they used the legally acquired master keys to simply unlock the heavy doors and march confidently right inside the private residence. Less than 2 minutes later, Vivian Pierce was physically escorted out the massive front door by 2 stern female police officers. It was an absolutely pathetic, highly satisfying sight. The self-proclaimed untouchable queen of the high society church galas was not wearing a custom designer gown or her incredibly expensive diamond jewelry. She was wearing cheap wrinkled silk pajamas. Her hair was a wildly tangled, chaotic mess, and her expensive designer makeup was completely smeared heavily down her face from crying hysterically all night long. She was screaming frantically at the calm police officers, aggressively waving her manicured hands wildly in the air, but her loud, toxic voice carried absolutely no authority anymore. She was no longer a wealthy, powerful socialite. She was just a trespassing civilian actively refusing to vacate private corporate property. The massive, loud commotion quickly drew the undivided attention of her incredibly wealthy neighbors. The exact same elite high society friends Vivian had spent 20 years aggressively trying to impress began curiously stepping out of their massive luxury mansions. But they did not rush over to comfort her. They did not offer her a warm, safe place to stay or kindly demand that the police leave her alone. Instead, they stood safely on their perfectly manicured green lawns, eagerly pulling out their incredibly expensive cell phones and aggressively hitting record. They shamelessly filmed Vivian's total public downfall, eager to instantly share the highly humiliating footage on their exclusive country club group chats and private social media pages. Vivian suddenly noticed the glowing camera lenses pointing directly at her from across the wide street. She froze completely, entirely realizing that her absolute worst nightmare had just violently come true. She let out a loud, agonizing, highly dramatic wail of pure, profound despair, desperately trying to cover her ruined, tear-stained face with her shaking hands. Her entire fake elite socialite life was being actively broadcasted to the exact wealthy people she had worshipped her entire pathetic life. The sheer, absolute humiliation physically dropped her to her knees right there on the hard concrete driveway. Calvin Pierce stumbled slowly out of the massive front doors a few agonizing seconds later. He was wearing the exact same highly wrinkled custom tuxedo from the disastrous restaurant dinner, looking exactly like a completely hollow, entirely empty shell of a man. He did not yell at the professional movers. He did not aggressively threaten the armed police officers. He simply dragged his expensive leather shoes across the smooth pavement. His head hung incredibly low, entirely defeated by the massive, crushing weight of his total public failure. He silently climbed into the back of a cheap yellow taxicab the police had kindly ordered for them, looking absolutely nothing like the powerful, untouchable billionaire he had aggressively pretended to be. Kendrick followed closely behind his highly defeated parents. The arrogant golden boy was awkwardly carrying two quickly stuffed black plastic garbage bags full of his expensive designer clothes and expensive imported shoes. He looked wildly around the beautiful manicured lawn, his eyes darting frantically back and forth, as if he were desperately hoping someone would magically wake him up from this terrifying, brutal financial nightmare. He tossed the cheap garbage bags into the trunk of the yellow taxicab and climbed into the back seat, completely hanging his head in absolute deeply earned shame. The taxicab slowly pulled out of the massive circular driveway, carrying the entirely destroyed Pierce family, far away from the elite world they had aggressively poisoned for so long. I rolled up my dark-tinted window and calmly drove away, heading directly back to my modest apartment, where my brilliant sister was safely waiting. The heavy, suffocating dark cloud that had aggressively hung over our entire lives had finally been completely permanently lifted. When I walked confidently through my front door, Nia was sitting quietly at the small kitchen table, holding her cell phone with a look of pure absolute disgust radiating from her beautiful face. She did not say a word. She simply turned the glowing electronic screen directly toward me. It was a massive, continuous wall of desperate, frantic text messages from Kendrick. He was actively begging her for a highly unearned second chance. He claimed he had always truly, deeply loved her. He aggressively blamed his toxic, arrogant parents for the entire massive wedding disaster, trying desperately to completely wash his own hands of the cruel, abusive behavior. He pleaded with her to please take him back rapidly, promising they could easily run away together and start a brand new beautiful life far away from the heavy drama. Kendrick was completely, totally broke. He was entirely homeless and desperately trying to violently cling to the only purely good thing he had ever had in his entire pathetic, lazy life. Nia did not cry a single tear over his pathetic, desperate begging. She did not feel a single solitary ounce of human pity for the weak, cowardly man who had happily stood by and let his toxic family treat her older sister like absolute garbage. She calmly looked up at me and quietly asked me to forward her the digital scan of the legally binding corporate contract Calvin had officially signed earlier that morning. I pulled out my phone and sent the secure, highly classified file directly to her device. Nia calmly opened the crisp document on her screen. She took a highly clear, perfectly cropped screenshot of Calvin's shaky, deeply terrified signature, officially surrendering all their massive fake wealth, and immediately attached the powerful image directly to Kendrick's desperate text thread. She did not type a long emotional paragraph explaining her deeply hurt feelings. She did not angrily curse at him or aggressively demand a massive apology. She simply typed exactly 4 highly devastating words. "Have a nice life." She firmly hit send, confidently watched the final message clearly deliver to his phone, and then permanently entirely blocked his phone number across every single digital platform. She placed her phone securely face down on the wooden kitchen table, looked directly up at me, and smiled an incredibly beautiful, genuinely, completely free smile. The massive absolute catharsis washing over her bright face was entirely worth every single difficult sacrifice I had ever made in my entire life. We were finally completely, entirely free from their dark, toxic shadow. We had successfully burned their fake empire to the ground and emerged completely victorious. I walked slowly over to the kitchen table and wrapped my arms tightly around her, pulling her into a deeply comforting, warm embrace. The future was completely ours. We did not need their fake money or their toxic validation. We had each other, and that was more than enough to build a magnificent legacy together. While Calvin and Vivian Pierce were being aggressively and forcefully evicted from their fake high society lives, another highly satisfying scene of absolute justice was simultaneously unfolding on the exact opposite side of the city. Aunt Yvonne had frantically rushed back to her supposedly successful independent insurance brokerage firm very early that morning. She was desperately attempting to quietly transfer all her remaining stolen financial assets into highly untraceable private offshore accounts before my elite corporate lawyers could officially freeze them. She was sweating profusely, her bright yellow dress from the previous night completely replaced by a heavily wrinkled cheap blouse as she frantically, aggressively shoved highly sensitive documents into a loud paper shredder. She genuinely believed she could quickly outsmart the federal government and easily escape the massive incoming legal storm. But she was entirely far too late. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, 4 unmarked dark government vehicles aggressively pulled up directly in front of her busy commercial office building. 6 highly intimidating state insurance regulators, accompanied by 2 armed federal agents in dark suits, marched confidently through the front glass doors of her brokerage. Aunt Yvonne looked up from her computer screen, her eyes widening in absolute unadulterated terror as she saw the bright, shiny gold badges flashing dangerously under the harsh fluorescent office lights. The lead federal agent did not politely ask her to quietly step into a private back room for a friendly chat. He loudly declared that her entire commercial business was officially under immediate federal seizure for massive corporate wire fraud and aggravated grand larceny. Yvonne was physically, forcefully escorted out of her own private office building, wearing shiny silver handcuffs, while all of her completely shocked employees eagerly watched the entire deeply humiliating spectacle. She desperately tried to hide her highly terrified, ruined face from the local news cameras that had mysteriously received a highly anonymous early morning tip about the massive high-profile federal raid. The deeply toxic, cowardly woman who had aggressively stolen the absolute only financial safety net my parents had left us was finally completely stripped of her fake independence and her stolen wealth. She would spend the rest of her rapidly aging, pathetic life aggressively fighting a completely unwinnable federal criminal case. Every single toxic family member who had actively, maliciously participated in our abuse had been entirely, completely neutralized. They were officially permanently erased from our bright, beautiful future. Exactly 3 highly productive weeks later, the oppressive summer heat had finally beautifully broken, revealing a crisp, elegant autumn morning in the busy city. I was standing comfortably in my massive penthouse executive office at Apex Equity Partners. The heavy, polished mahogany doors swung open smoothly, and Nia walked confidently into the bright room. She was no longer the highly stressed, terrified bride desperately trying to mold her beautiful, authentic self into the highly toxic Pierce family image. She was radiating absolute, pure, undeniable corporate power. She wore a stunning, custom-tailored emerald green business suit that perfectly complemented her bright, incredibly confident smile. In her hands, she proudly held a heavy custom-polished wooden frame. Inside the pristine glass sat her official Juris Doctor degree from Spelman College, completely untouched and entirely unblemished by the massive fraudulent civil lawsuit Calvin Pierce had desperately attempted to use against her. Nia walked smoothly across the plush carpet and gently placed the heavy frame degree directly onto my massive glass executive desk. "We officially did it, Desiree," she said, her voice filled with deep, profound emotion and incredible relief. The State Bar Association completely entirely dismissed the ridiculous fabricated grievance the Pierces desperately tried to file. "My legal license is entirely clear and fully active." I smiled warmly, looking down at her beautiful name printed elegantly on the crisp academic parchment. "I never had a single solitary doubt, Nia," I replied proudly. "You earned this massive academic achievement through your own incredible, relentless hard work and your brilliant, sharp mind. Nobody can ever aggressively take that away from you." I reached into the top drawer of my glass desk and pulled out a sleek, heavy silver electronic key card. It was securely attached to a premium leather lanyard officially stamped with the highly respected Apex Equity corporate logo. I walked slowly around the massive desk and gently placed the key card directly into her open palm. Nia looked down at the silver card, her brow furrowing in slight genuine confusion. "What exactly is this?" she asked, looking up at me with bright, curious eyes. "That is the master access key to the massive corner executive office right down the hall." I explained, my smile growing much wider. "I do not just need a highly intelligent, loving sister, Nia. I need a brilliant, highly aggressive corporate lawyer to help me fiercely legally protect this massive financial empire we are actively building together. If you are officially ready, I would be incredibly honored to formally welcome you as the brand new Chief Legal Counsel of Apex Equity Partners." Nia gasped loudly, her beautiful eyes instantly rapidly filling with happy, incredibly grateful tears. She aggressively threw her arms tightly around my neck, hugging me much tighter than she ever had before in her entire life. "Thank you, Desiree," she whispered, her voice cracking with pure, absolute joy. "Thank you for aggressively, fiercely protecting me. Thank you for never ever giving up on us." We walked together over to the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, looking out over the sprawling, beautiful, highly active skyline of Atlanta. The massive city was bustling with complex corporate deals and millions of busy people, but in our private penthouse sanctuary, everything was perfectly, beautifully peaceful. We had successfully, miraculously survived the deepest, darkest, vicious betrayals from the exact toxic people who were supposed to unconditionally love and protect us. We did not desperately beg for a tiny, pathetic seat at their highly toxic, arrogant table. We aggressively, proudly built our own massive, magnificent table, our own undeniable generational wealth, and our own absolute permanent peace. If you are watching this video right now, I want you to actively listen to my voice very carefully. Your true, incredible worth is never ever defined by the highly toxic people who blindly, foolishly refuse to see your immense value. If your own family members or your arrogant, entitled in-laws actively treat you like an unwanted heavy burden, if they aggressively, maliciously try to make you feel poor, uneducated, or entirely unworthy of their fake elite presence, it is absolutely time to permanently stop fighting for their deeply conditional toxic approval. Do not ever let anyone aggressively push you into a dark, lonely corner by the noisy kitchen doors. You have the absolute incredible power to confidently walk away. You have the massive inner strength to build your own beautiful, massive empire from the absolute ground up. Sometimes, the absolute greatest revenge is not actively destroying the people who deeply hurt you, although that is highly, deeply satisfying. The absolute greatest permanent revenge is becoming so incredibly successful, so utterly deeply peaceful, and so completely undeniably powerful that their toxic little dark world entirely ceases to exist in your beautiful, bright reality. Have you ever had to bravely, fiercely stand up and completely walk away from a highly toxic family member or a deeply abusive, entitled in-law who aggressively, dangerously underestimated your true worth? How did you finally find the incredible inner courage to actively build your own beautiful, peaceful table? I would absolutely love to read your amazing, powerful personal stories in the comments section below. Please hit the like button and actively subscribe to my channel if this powerful story deeply resonated with your own brave personal journey. Always remember, you are incredibly valuable. You are entirely undeniably worthy, and your beautiful, authentic life is just actively beginning. True worth is never defined by the labels toxic people place on you. Desiree's story proves that silent resilience and strategic growth are far more powerful than loud, empty arrogance. While others focus on a facade of status, focus on building an unshakable foundation of independence. Never sacrifice your dignity for a seat at a table where you aren't respected. The greatest victory is not just proving them wrong, but reaching a level of success where their opinions no longer matter. Value your own sacrifice and walk away from those who seek only to exploit your kindness and hard work. Have you ever stood up to a toxic family member to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below.